Picture the most important meal you've ever cooked. Now imagine the person you're cooking it for will be dead before it digests. Now imagine you are 17 years old. It is 3 in the morning. Your hands are trembling slightly from cold and something that isn't quite cold. And the sauce you're stirring smells so good it makes your eyes water, and you cannot stop thinking about whether he'll actually taste it or whether it will just sit on the plate, perfect and untouched, while a man says his prayers in the room above you and tries to remember how to breathe. That's the Tower of London in October of 1535. Not the version you've seen in paintings, not the version on the postcards that don't exist yet. The real version, which smells like river mud and rendered fat and wet stone, and the particular quality of torchlight burning in a space where the walls are 6 feet thick, and the windows face a courtyard where the grass is kept very short for reasons you prefer not to think about. We're going back there tonight. Not as visitors standing behind velvet ropes, not as tourists squinting at informational placards about the wives of Henry VIII. We're going as the boy in the kitchen, the one who got handed the job nobody else wanted, the one who stood in front of the head cook at midnight and heard 2 sentences that changed his entire understanding of what it meant to make something beautiful. One day, one task, everything it would have meant to do it, smell it, carry it, set it down, and watch a man try to eat. I make these stories, I record them late at night, which makes me feel a certain kinship with the kitchen workers of Tudor England, who also spent late nights in firelit rooms doing work that had to be finished before dawn regardless of how their hands felt about it. If you're listening to this in the dark, good. The dark is where this story lives. Get comfortable. Here we go. You've been working in the kitchens of the Tower of London for 2 years and 4 months, which is long enough to know which fires run hot and which run cold, and which one will make your left eye stream smoke if the wind shifts east, and not long enough to have stopped noticing how strange this place is. It's strange in ways that aren't immediately obvious. From the outside, the tower is a fortress. From the inside, it's a city. A small city, contained within walls, governed by its own rhythms and its own hierarchies, and its own specific language that you have spent 2 years learning without anyone teaching you. The way you learn all languages when you're surrounded by them and have no choice. There's the constable who runs the whole thing. There are the yeoman warders in their red coats, who guard the gates and walk the walls and will tell you stories all night if you bring them something to eat. There's the garrison, the soldiers who live here and practice and drink and fight with each other in the outer ward when they think nobody senior is watching. There are clerks and chaplains and servants, and the particular species of hanger-on who attaches himself to power and becomes indispensable in small, invisible ways until the day he's no longer needed. And there are the prisoners. You don't think about the prisoners too much. That's not exactly a rule, but it functions like one. The prisoners are in their lodgings in the various towers that ring the outer walls, and the kitchen is in the inner ward, and the 2 worlds overlap occasionally, but not in ways you're invited to think about. Food goes up. Empty plates come back down. That's the transaction. You're a kitchen hand. Your name is Thomas Apsley. Your father was a cook in a house in Cheapside until the house burned and the family scattered, and you ended up here at 15 through a chain of events involving your mother's cousin and a man named Brewer who owed someone a favour, and you've never been entirely certain of the details. What you know is that you arrived with a sack containing a change of clothes and a knife you'd been given by your father, and a letter of introduction that said you were honest and hard-working, which was true, and that you had some knowledge of the kitchen, which was less true, but you learned. The head cook is a man named Giles Fortescue. He is 53 years old and looks 70, with hands the colour and texture of old leather and a voice like gravel being poured into a bucket. He is not cruel, which distinguishes him from a significant number of people in authority in the England of 1535. He is demanding and precise and occasionally terrifying, and he can taste the difference between nutmeg and mace at 10 feet, which is a skill that sounds like a joke until you've seen him do it and realise he's using it to humiliate you specifically. It is Giles who calls you over on the evening of October the 14th. The kitchen is busy. It's always busy. There are 9 of you in various states of activity around the 3 main fires, and the smell in the room is a specific compound thing that you've stopped being able to identify individually, and now just experience as the smell of here, the way you stop smelling your own house after a week of living in it. There's roasting meat and wood ash, and the sweet rot of vegetable scraps in the corner bin, and hot fat and something herbs, and underneath all of it, always, the salt mud smell of the Thames coming through the door they leave open for the smoke. Giles is standing at the far end of the room near the door that leads to the cold larder, and he's holding a piece of paper, and he's looking at it the way he looks at things that require him to deliver information he doesn't especially want to deliver. "Thomas," he says. "Yes, sir." "Come here." You come here. You wipe your hands on your apron, which is stained with the evidence of everything you've touched today, and you cross the room and you stand in front of him, and he looks at you for a moment with those eyes that are the colour of river water in autumn. "You know Sir William Harwood," he says. "You know of him. He arrived at the Tower 6 weeks ago. He occupies the upper chamber of the Beauchamp Tower, which is where they put the ones who are significant but not quite significant enough for the royal apartments. He is, by what little you've gathered from the fragments of conversation that drift through kitchens the way conversation always drifts through kitchens, a knight of some standing who became involved in something involving someone close to someone important, and then became, as everyone in his position always eventually becomes, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be spoken with." "I know of him," you say. Giles nods. He folds the paper slowly and puts it in his apron pocket, which is a gesture that means this conversation is about to require your full attention. "He's to be executed tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, the inner ward." A pause. "He's requested a last meal." You wait. "I'm giving the task to you." And there it is. You look at him. He looks at you. Outside, somewhere in the courtyard, one of the garrison dogs is barking at something, and then it stops. "Why me?" you ask, which is not the right thing to say, but is the thing that comes out. Giles' expression doesn't change. "Because you're the one I trust not to make a mess of it," which is a compliment if you hold it the right way. It still feels like a stone dropped into your stomach. What did he request? Giles reaches into the other apron pocket and produces a second piece of paper. This one smaller and written in a different hand, neater and more careful. The hand of a man who had time to think about what he was writing. You take it. The paper is slightly damp from the pocket and the kitchen air, and the ink is good quality, dark and precise. The list reads, broth of beef, well seasoned, roasted capon with verjuice sauce, a dish of eels stewed with herbs, white bread, fresh, manchet loaves, hard cheese, dried fruits and spiced nuts, hippocras wine, 2 cups, a small dish of sugar confections if it can be managed, and at the bottom, in slightly smaller script, "I would be grateful if the broth could be hot when it arrives. Not warm, hot. You read it twice. You fold it and put it in your own apron pocket and stand there for a moment with your hand flat over it, pressing it against your hip. The wine is in the lower cellar, third rack from the door, Giles says. The capon, take the fat one, second row on the left, the one with the good weight to it. The eels came in this afternoon, they're fresh. Everything else you know where to find. When does it need to be ready? 5 o'clock in the morning. He wants time to eat before the chaplain comes again at 6. 5 o'clock. It's now past 8 in the evening. That gives you 9 hours, which is enough time if you start now and don't stop. You'll carry it up yourself, Giles says. All of it. 1 tray, 2 trips if you need. The warder will let you in. Don't linger. Yes, sir. Giles puts his hand on your shoulder briefly, which is the most physical comfort he's capable of, and then he turns away and starts talking to someone else about the next morning's general breakfast provision, and you're left standing at the edge of the kitchen with a list in your pocket and 9 hours and a feeling in your chest that you don't have a word for yet. You'll find the word eventually. The word is something between dread and tenderness, and it doesn't have a proper name in English, or if it does, you haven't encountered it. What you feel is the specific weight of being asked to do something that matters more than anything you've been asked to do before, for someone who will not be alive to appreciate whether you did it well. You tie your apron tighter, and you start. The cold larder is a room cut into the lower level of the kitchen building, where the air is consistently several degrees below the main floor, cold enough that you can see your breath in it on nights like this one. The walls are stone and the floor is stone, and everything smells of salt and hanging meat and the faint sweetness of rendered fat stored in clay pots along the back shelf. The capon is where Giles said it would be. You take it down from the hook with both hands and hold it a moment, feeling the weight of it, the solid cold heft of a bird that had a full and presumably satisfactory life right up until it didn't. It's a good size, 3, maybe 3.5 pounds. The skin is pale and tight and slightly waxy in the torchlight, and the smell of it is clean. No sourness, which means it came in recently and was handled correctly. You think about the man in the room upstairs who wrote, in neat, careful script, roasted capon with verjuice sauce. You wonder what he was thinking about when he wrote it. Whether he was thinking about a specific meal he'd had before, some feast in some hall where the capon was particularly good, and he'd sat back afterward and felt full and pleased and entirely unaware that a day like tomorrow was approaching. Whether he was thinking about the sauce specifically, the sharp brightness of verjuice, which is made from unripe grapes, and has that particular quality of tasting simultaneously like something and like the absence of something, like flavour with an edge of regret built into it, which seems appropriate in a way you don't want to think about too carefully. You carry the capon back to the main kitchen and find a clean board and your sharpest knife, the one your father gave you, the one with the handle worn smooth from use, and you start preparing it. The knife goes in at the joint, firm and precise. The skin separates cleanly. There is a specific sound to breaking down a bird, a series of small cracks and tears and the muffled thud of the joint separating, and you work through it methodically, the way you were taught, the way that makes it more about craft than about anything else. You're making something. That's what this is. You're making something for someone the same as you always do. And the fact that it's the last something you'll ever make for this particular person doesn't change the process. The knife goes in at the joint. The bone gives. The pieces separate clean. You lay them out on the board. The smell of raw capon is a cool, slightly sweet smell, almost neutral, like the smell of something that hasn't become what it's going to become yet. which is also, you realise, and then don't let yourself finish the thought. There are 3 fires in the main kitchen. The biggest one, at the north wall, is where the serious roasting happens, the full sides of meat, the joints that need 4 or 5 hours and constant turning. The middle fire, which you've always thought of as the thinking fire, because it's where Giles stands when he's working through a problem, is steady and even and perfect for the slower work, the sauces and the braises and the things that need watching. The small fire at the east wall is yours by informal assignment, has been yours for about a year since Giles decided you'd earned it. You use the middle fire tonight. The capon pieces go into the wide iron pan with a piece of salt pork rendered down for fat, and the smell that immediately rises is the smell of meat beginning to become something. That first deep, savoury note that you've never been able to put a name to except to say it smells like wanting, like appetite, like the specific response of a body to a thing it needs. He wrote, "I would be grateful if the broth could be hot when it arrives, not warm, hot." That one line has been sitting in the back of your mind since you read it, and you keep returning to it because of what it implies about the man who wrote it. He's someone who has been served lukewarm broth before. He's someone who knows the difference. He's someone who, even now, even on the evening before the morning that will end everything, cares about the temperature of his soup and is precise enough to specify it and polite enough to say grateful and not demanding. Whatever he did, whatever the thing was that brought him here to this room in this tower on this riverbank, he is clearly someone who lived his entire life inside a certain set of standards, and those standards have not left him just because tomorrow has. There's something about that you find yourself needing to honour. The broth is started before anything else. You find the beef bones in the cold larder, the good ones with the marrow still in them, and you crack them on the stone floor with the back of the cleaver, just enough to open them, and you put them in the deep pot with cold water and set it over the heat to come up slowly. The way good broth is always made, because fast heat makes the water cloudy and cloudy. Broth is an insult to anyone who knows what they're eating. While it heats, you add half an onion, the skin on for the colour, and a piece of dried root you take from the hanging bunches over the fire, and a small handful of whole peppercorns from the spice shelf, and 3 inches of a woody herb stem that will give it depth. The smell of broth beginning is the smell of patience made physical. It starts as almost nothing, just the faint mineral warmth of heated water, and then it becomes something denser, something more. By the time it reaches the first tremor of a simmer, the whole lower half of the kitchen smells different, warmer and more animal, and more like something worth sitting down for. You stir the capon, which is beginning to brown at the edges, and check the heat, and add a pour of white wine to the pan, which sends up a cloud of steam that smells strongly of wine and fat and capon all at once, and then you lower the heat slightly and leave it to find its rhythm. This is the part of cooking that nobody talks about, but everyone who's ever done it seriously knows about: the waiting, the tending, the 20 minutes where everything is happening but none of it is visible yet, where the chemistry is working and the heat is doing its job, and your only task is to be present and attentive and resist the urge to interfere. Cooking is mostly patience. The fire does the work. You're just there to make sure no one makes a mistake. The other kitchen workers are still at their tasks around the other fires, and they leave you alone. There's a quality to the silence that has grown around your corner of the room since Giles gave you the assignment. Not awkward exactly. More like the space you give a person who's carrying something heavy without actually being asked to help carry it. They know. Word moves through a kitchen the way water moves through stone, constantly and inevitably. They know what you're making and who it's for and what tomorrow morning means, and they've decided collectively, in the way that groups decide things without discussing them, that the right thing to do is give you room. You are grateful for this. You wouldn't know what to say if anyone said anything, and you're not sure you could keep your voice steady. The eels are in a wooden bucket in the cold larder, alive when they arrived, dead now, packed in ice that's starting to melt around the edges. They're good-sized, thick through the middle, with skin that's still slick and bright. Eels have a smell that you've never quite gotten used to. Something between river water and something older, something colder, something that lives at the bottom of things. You take out 3 of them and rinse them in clean water from the bucket by the door and bring them to the board. Breaking down an eel is different from breaking down a bird. The skin needs to come off first, and the way to do that is to make a cut just behind the head and then grip the skin with a cloth, because it's too slick to hold otherwise, and pull steadily with even pressure until it comes away clean. The first time you did this, you made a mess of it, the skin tearing, the meat tearing, Giles watching without expression from 6 feet away, and then saying, in his particular tone, that perhaps it would be worth doing that again. You've done it correctly every time since. The skin comes away clean now. The eel meat underneath is pale and slightly iridescent and smells sharply of what it is, and you take your knife and work it into sections, each one about 2 inches, clean cuts through the spine. Eel stewed with herbs. You need the right herbs for this. The ones that will balance the richness, that will cut through the fat without obliterating the flavour. You go to the herb shelf and take sprigs of what you need, running your thumb along the leaves of each one and holding it to your nose the way Giles taught you, the way of tasting with your face before anything goes in your mouth. Thyme, which smells like something slightly medicinal and green. Parsley, which smells bright and clean. A single leaf of something more resinous and dark that will give depth without taking over. You tie them together with a piece of kitchen string and put them aside. The capon needs attention. You turn the pieces in the pan with the long-handled fork, and the smell coming up is the smell of progress. Golden brown skin and wine, and the hint of something beginning to caramelize at the edges. You're building toward the verjuice sauce, which needs to be started separately. And the timing of that is the thing you're working out in your head while your hands do the immediate work. Verjuice is made from the juice of unripe grapes, or sometimes crab apples or unripe quinces, and it has a sharpness that is almost but not quite the sharpness of vinegar. More complex, more reluctant, the sourness of something that wanted to be sweet but was caught too early. In a sauce, it brightens everything. It cuts through fat the way a question cuts through an assumption, cleanly and completely. You add it to the pan with the browned capon pieces and hear the immediate violent sizzle, the liquid hitting hot metal and turning instantly to steam, and the smell that rises is complicated and good, wine and acid and meat all at once, the beginning of something worth waiting for. By midnight, the kitchen has quieted around you. The other workers finishing their tasks, the fires banked low, the room finding its nighttime temperature, which is always cooler than the working temperature, but never actually cold because the stone walls hold heat for hours after the fires drop. You're left alone with your 3 preparations going at different rhythms, the broth at a slow, steady simmer in the deep pot, the capon in its sauce over the middle fire, the eel waiting to be started, and the bread which needs to go in the baking oven within the next hour if it's going to have time to cool properly, and still be genuinely fresh when it's needed. The bread. You almost forgot about the bread. Forgot. Manchet loaves are small, fine, crumbed, pale-crusted rolls made from the whitest flour, the kind they sift and sift and sift again until what comes out is so fine and soft, it almost dissolves on your fingers when you touch it. White bread, fine bread, the bread of people who have access to the expensive flour, as opposed to the maslin and rye bread that most of the population eats. A manchet loaf is a status object as much as a food. It says something about who you are and what you expect. Sir William Harwood, who had access throughout his life to the finest everything, asked for manchet loaves. You make the dough. Your hands go into the flour and you find, as you always find, that this is the most physical part of cooking. The part where the body has to do sustained work, pressing the heel of your hand into the dough and folding and turning and pressing again, building the network of gluten that will hold the bread together and give it its texture. The dough resists you at first, stiff and crumbly, and then gradually it relents, becomes elastic, starts to give back to the push of your hand instead of just yielding under it. Your arms are burning slightly by the time it's ready, the pleasant deep burn of muscles that have done their job. The smell of raw dough is neutral and slightly yeasty, the smell of potential. The smell of baked bread is one of the most effective smells in human experience, one of those smells that bypasses thought and goes directly to something older, something that knows at a level below consciousness that this is good and safe and nourishing. You've been making bread for 2 years in this kitchen, and the smell of it coming out of the oven still produces in you a feeling that has nothing to do with your day, and everything to do with something more basic than that. The manchet loaves go into the baking oven at midnight, small round lumps of dough that will be golden topped and hollow sounding when you knock them in about 40 minutes. You go back to the capon. The sauce is reduced and the capon pieces are sitting in something golden brown and fragrant, and you taste it on the tip of a spoon and add a pinch of salt and a small amount of something sweet to round the edges and taste it again. And it's good. It's genuinely good. Not just serviceable, not just adequate, but the kind of thing that, if you served it to a person who had a choice about eating it, they would stop for a moment after the first taste and look slightly surprised. You wonder if he'll taste it, really taste it, or whether you eat differently when you know it's the last time, whether the knowledge itself changes the experience of the food, whether everything becomes simultaneously more vivid and less real when you're looking across the table at the morning the way you might look at an approaching wall. The eel goes in a second pan with butter and the herb bundle and a pour of water, covered with a damp cloth to keep the steam in, and the smell it releases immediately is the smell of eels transforming, which is a more dramatic smell than most transformations. The strong river bottom sharpness beginning to mellow and sweeten and absorb the herbs, the whole thing becoming something gentler and more complicated than what it started as. Eels are a working man's food mostly, cheap and plentiful from the Thames, eaten stewed or jellied or fried in the riverside taverns and sold from baskets in the streets. But stewed properly, in butter, with the right herbs, they become something quite different, something a man with refined tastes might actually want. Maybe that's why he requested them. Maybe eels meant something to him specifically. Maybe he grew up near a river, or had a cook who made them a particular way, or ate them at a table that meant something. Food is memory as much as it's sustenance. You eat a thing and you're eating every time you ate it before, every room and every season and every version of yourself that ever sat down to a plate of it. He asked for eels. There's a whole world in that request that you'll never know anything about. At 1 in the morning you sit down on the stool by the east fire with a piece of yesterday's bread and a cup of small beer and eat in 5 minutes, standing back up while you're still swallowing because the broth needs tasting and the capon needs checking and the manchet loaves are almost certainly ready. They are ready. You pull them from the oven with the paddle, 8 small golden rounds sitting on the paddle's face, and you tap each one on the bottom and hear the hollow sound that means the crumb is right, and you set them on the rack to cool and the smell of fresh bread fills the kitchen immediately, completely, overwhelming everything else for a moment with something that smells unmistakably like warmth and care and the specific human act of making something good. By 2 o'clock the eels are done. You lift the cover off the pan and taste the cooking liquid, which has become something worth reducing and using, and you add a small amount of the verjuice from the capon sauce, which creates a brief sizzle and a cloud of fragrant steam, and you let it reduce for 5 more minutes and taste again, and it's right. The sharpness balanced against the richness of the butter and the depth of the herbs, the eel itself yielding and sweet when you press a piece gently with the spoon. You think about temperature. He asked for the broth to be hot. Hot means it needs to be as recently removed from the fire as possible, which means timing the delivery precisely so that the broth travels the distance from kitchen to tower chamber in the minimum possible time, which means everything else needs to be ready first, so the only thing left when 5 o'clock approaches is filling the broth bowl and walking. You start to think about containers. The tower kitchen has a collection of service vessels kept in a cupboard near the cold larder door. The pieces reserved for the kind of food that needs to arrive in something appropriate. There's a covered bowl for broth, dark pewter with a slightly convex lid that holds heat reasonably well, a flat-bottomed dish with a hinged cover for the main course, a smaller dish for the eels, a basket for the bread, a cup for the wine, and a bottle to carry it in. You lay them out on the long work table and look at them. They are clean and slightly dull in the torchlight, pewter having that quality of absorbing light rather than reflecting it, which makes it look more serious than silver, more real. You run your thumb along the inside of the broth bowl and it comes away clean. Good. The sugar confections, which he requested as an afterthought, if it can be managed, have been in the back of your mind for the last 2 hours. The tower kitchen keeps a stock of dried fruits and some spiced nuts. Easy enough. The sugar confections are another matter. Actual sugar work, even simple pastilles or candied fruits, requires time and the right ingredients, and a particular technique with the copper pan, and you've watched Giles do it, but never done it yourself with any great success. You decide to do it anyway. The sugar is in a sealed pottery jar on the high shelf, because sugar in 1535 is expensive, genuinely expensive. Not expensive the way luxury things are expensive, but expensive the way necessary medicine is expensive, the price reflecting how far it's travelled and how many hands it's passed through and how difficult it is to produce. You measure out what you need, which is not very much, a handful, and you put it in the small copper pan with a spoonful of water and set it over the lowest part of the middle fire, the part where the coals are barely giving off heat. Sugar in water. You stir it constantly. Giles has told you 100 times, stir constantly, never let it sit. The moment you stop stirring is the moment it burns, and burned, sugar is a specific catastrophe. It scorches into something black and acrid that you can smell on fingers for a day and a half and contaminates anything nearby. You stir and watch, the mixture going from cloudy to clearer, from liquid to something more viscous, the smell shifting from nothing to something sweetly warm, to something intensely sugary and concentrated. At the right moment, which is a moment you know by sight and by smell, and by the way the mixture falls from the spoon, you stir in a small amount of rosewater from the bottle on the back shelf, and a pinch of ginger, and a pinch of cinnamon, and the smell that rises from the pan is extraordinary. Sweet and spiced and impossibly fragrant in the kitchen air, something that cuts through the meat smells and the smoke smell, and fills the room with the smell of somewhere else entirely, somewhere warmer and more decorated and more careful. You pour it carefully onto a piece of parchment paper in small drops, each one about the size of a halfpenny, and they cool and harden as you watch, turning from liquid amber to firm little discs, each one slightly different in shape, slightly different in exact colour, all of them faintly glossy in the firelight. They are not perfect. They are not the work of a professional confectioner, but they are genuinely made with sugar and rosewater and spice, and they will taste like they're supposed to taste. And the man upstairs in the Beauchamp Tower will taste the cinnamon and the rose and the sweetness. And if he closes his eyes for a moment when he does, that will be worth the burned thumb you sustained when a drop of hot sugar landed on the back of your left hand at the moment you were pouring. You don't make a sound when it happens. You press the burned spot briefly against the cold stone surface of the work table and breathe through it and keep pouring. There's no time to stop. There's only the work. By 4 o'clock in the morning you have broth, capon in verjuice sauce, stewed eels, 8 manchet loaves cooling on the rack, a small pile of dried fruits and spiced nuts in a wooden dish, the sugar confections hardened and lifted off the parchment and arranged in a small pile, and 2 measures of hippocras wine drawn from the bottle in the lower cellar and standing in the pewter cup. Hippocras is wine mixed with honey and spices, the specific blend varying by house and by occasion, and the tower's supply is a decent quality, not the very best, but the spices have been in it long enough to be fully incorporated, and the whole thing tastes of something between wine and a medicine that you'd actually want. You taste a small amount on the tip of your finger and nod to yourself. It's good. Warm enough to be served as is without needing to heat it, which you were slightly worried about. You stand back and look at the spread of food on the table in front of you. It's 5 o'clock in the morning. The kitchen is quiet. The fire has died back to coals and you're working by the light of 2 tallow candles, which makes everything slightly warmer and less certain at the edges, the food sitting in amber light and smelling extraordinary. You're tired. Your feet hurt and your arms ache, and there's a faint continuous throb in your left thumb where the sugar burn is, and you haven't slept and won't sleep, and tomorrow will come regardless of how tired you are. But you're looking at something you made, something complete, and there's a feeling that comes with that which doesn't have a name either, but is something like having done right by someone, having given your best to a task that deserved it. You start to assemble the tray. The broth stays in the pot over the lowest possible heat, while everything else goes on. You lay out the covered serving dishes on the large wooden tray, the flat capon dish and the smaller eel dish side by side, the bread basket lined with a piece of clean cloth, 8 manchet loaves filling it from edge to edge, their golden tops faintly gleaming, the small dish of dried fruits and nuts, the sugar confections on a piece of fresh parchment, the wine. At exactly 5 minutes before 5 o'clock, you ladle the broth into the pewter bowl, fill it as full as it will go without spilling, and settle the lid on firmly, pressing it down with both hands to trap the heat inside, and you can feel the warmth of it through the metal. even through your fingertips, which means the temperature inside is where it needs to be. You pick up the tray. It's heavy. Heavier than you expected when you laid it out, because individual dishes have a weight that distributes in your mind when they're separate, and then announces itself all at once when they're together. You adjust your grip, find the balance, take a breath. The kitchen door is propped open. The courtyard outside is dark. The only light coming from the torches at the two gate positions and one more at the entrance to the lower ward. The cobblestones are slick from a rain that came through sometime after midnight without you noticing, and the smell of the air outside is everything the kitchen isn't, cold and wet and raw. The river smell coming in on the east wind, which in October has a particular quality of telling you that winter is not interested in your opinion about its arrival. You cross the courtyard carefully. The tray is steady in your hands and you watch your feet on the slick cobblestones and focus on nothing except moving from where you are to where you need to be, which is the entrance to the Beauchamp Tower at the far north end of the inner ward. The Beauchamp Tower is a 3-story stone building attached to the western wall, and it is, in the specific context of Tudor prison architecture, a relatively comfortable place to spend your last weeks of life. The prisoners kept here are not in dungeons. They have rooms, they have furnishings, they have access to light from the high narrow windows. Noble prisoners were expected to be imprisoned in a manner appropriate to their status, which meant that even as the state was preparing to execute you, it was also making sure you had adequate bed linens. The warder at the door is a broad man named Fletcher, who you know slightly from the several dozen times you've brought food to this door over the past 2 years. He looks at the tray and then at you and then at the sky, which is beginning to change colour at the eastern edge in a way that means 5 o'clock has either already happened or is about to. Apsley, he says. Fletcher. He looks at the tray again for a moment, something moving across his face that he straightens back out by reflex, and then he steps aside and opens the door and waves you through. The staircase inside is stone, narrow, lit by a torch in an iron bracket at the first landing. The stairs are worn in the middle from centuries of feet, and they curve tightly enough that you have to angle the tray to get it around the corners, which requires a kind of spatial calculation you do more or less automatically, the way you navigate any confined space with your hands full. The second floor. Another door, heavier, with a lock and no latch. You stand before it and wait, because you can't knock with your hands full. And after a moment you hear a sound from inside, and then the sound of someone moving, footsteps on stone, and then the door opens. Sir William Harwood is 51 years old, and this is the first time you've seen him. He's a tall man, or was a tall man. He's standing now in a slight forward lean that might be cold or fatigue or something else, with hair that's mostly grey, and a face that was probably handsome 15 years ago, and is still the face of someone who spent most of his life being taken seriously. He's wearing a good wool doublet, dark blue, and hose that have been recently brushed, and his shoes are polished. He is dressed, it occurs to you, the same way the prisoners you saw on the execution cart at Tyburn had been dressed, for a kind of occasion, for the ritual of it, for the maintenance of a dignity that has no practical value anymore, but that he's not prepared to abandon. He looks at the tray, then at you. "You're young," he says. "Yes, sir." "How old?" 17, sir." He nods slowly, the way a person nods when the answer confirms something they already suspected. He steps back from the door and gestures you in. The room is larger than you expected, larger than most rooms in most buildings you've been in, with 2 high windows on the south wall through which you can see, dimly, the first grey thinning of the pre-dawn sky. There's a bed, properly made, and a table, and a chair, and several tallow candles burning on the table and the windowsill, and a small brazier in the corner radiating an amount of warmth that makes the room feel, compared to the staircase you've just come up, almost warm. On the table, pushed to one side, is a book, open and face down to mark the place. You set the tray on the table carefully, moving the book to give yourself room, and then stand back. Your arms are grateful for the absence of the weight. Sir William Harwood pulls the chair out from the table and sits down. He doesn't look at the food immediately. He looks at the window, at the grey lightening sky. For a moment, and then he looks back at the tray. He reaches out and lifts the lid of the broth bowl. The steam rises immediately, dense and fragrant, carrying the smell of the beef bones and the pepper and the onion and the herbs up into the candlelit air of the room, and the smell is the smell of something unambiguously warm and nourishing and real, something that insists on the ordinary fact of being a body that needs sustenance regardless of everything else. It's the smell of care, of effort, of someone somewhere below him, working through the night to make something right. He holds his hands over the bowl for a moment, warming them in the steam. "Hot," he says. "Yes, sir, I made sure." He looks at you then, actually looks at you, and his eyes are grey and tired and something that isn't quite sadness, but isn't quite not sadness either. And he says, "What's your name?" "Thomas, sir. Thomas Apsley." "Thomas Apsley." He tries it, the way you try a new sound. "Are you good at this? The cooking?" "I'm learning, sir." He nods. He picks up the spoon and dips it into the broth and lifts it to his mouth and tastes it, carefully, with his eyes almost closed. And there's a moment of silence in the room during which the only sounds are the faint crackle of the brazier and the distant call of a gull outside. "Yes," he says very quietly, setting the spoon down. "You are." You stand by the door while he eats. This is the correct thing to do. This is what the protocol requires. A servant stands until dismissed. You keep your hands at your sides and your face composed, and you watch Sir William Harwood eat the broth you spent the night making. And you discover that watching a person eat is one of the more intimate things you can do, without being intimate at all, because eating is private in a way that people forget when they have company. The way the face changes when the body's given something it needs, the involuntary quality of it, the slight release of some held tension around the eyes and the jaw. He eats the broth slowly. Not the way a hungry man eats, which is quickly and without ceremony, but the way a careful man eats something he wants to remember, lifting the spoon and pausing between each mouthful, occasionally just holding the spoon over the bowl and looking at the steam as if the steam itself is something he wants to take in. The room is almost completely silent. Outside the window, the sky is continuing its slow project of becoming light, the grey deepening slightly and then thinning again, the early October dawn moving at its own pace regardless of what day this is for anyone inside these walls. The capon is next. He lifts the cover of the main dish and the smell of the verjuice sauce fills the room immediately, and he leans slightly over the dish for a moment in the same way he held his hands over the broth, taking the smell in before anything else. There is something deliberate about everything he does, something that says he is choosing to be present for this, choosing to actually experience the sensory fact of it, rather than going through motions while his mind is somewhere else. It makes you feel the weight of what you made in a way you didn't entirely anticipate. "Verjuice," he says, not a question. "Yes, sir." "My mother's cook used verjuice on capon." He picks up the knife and fork and cuts a piece from the breast, a clean, precise cut, and puts it in his mouth. And there is another silence, and then he says, "You reduced it correctly. A lot of cooks don't. They use it too early and it goes thin." "My master showed me," you say. "Giles Fortescue." Fortescue. He tries the name. "I don't know him." "He's been here 12 years, sir. He was at court before that, under a previous head cook." "Good training." He cuts another piece. "You're fortunate in your teacher." You watch him work through the capon with the methodical attention of a man who cooked for himself once, or at least watched cooking done closely enough to understand it, and who has opinions about what he's eating that are not the general opinions of someone who simply wants to be full. He eats the way a craftsman handles a well-made object, with appreciation for specific qualities. He notices the texture of the sauce, which is the right texture, thick enough to coat the meat but not so thick it overwhelms it. He notices the slight caramelization at the edge of the skin, which happened in the first stage over the middle fire, when the pieces browned before the sauce was added, and which gives the dish a depth of flavour that plain roasted capon doesn't have. He doesn't say these things. You can see him noticing them in the way he eats, in the quality of his attention. You think about the people who will not notice things tomorrow. All the people who will eat tomorrow morning in ordinary circumstances, in ordinary rooms, eating ordinary food without thinking about any of it, who will get through Tuesday the 15th of October 1535 without any sense of what it is to be here in this room, watching a man taste something carefully because it is the last careful tasting he will ever do. The eels. He looks at them when he opens the third dish with the slight change in expression that you read, after a moment, as something like recognition, or perhaps the look of a person seeing something they hoped would be there, and were not entirely certain would be. "Stewed," he says. "With herbs, sir. Thyme, parsley and one other. And butter." "Thames eels?" "Yes, sir, they came in yesterday. They were fresh." He's quiet for a moment, looking at the dish. Then he says, "I grew up on the river. Not here. Upstream, past Twickenham. The eels there were better than anywhere else I've ever eaten and fattier. My father used to say the eels from that stretch knew something the other eels didn't." A pause. "He probably said it about the fishing more than the eels specifically, but I remember it." He takes an eel piece and puts it in his mouth, and there is a silence that is different from the other silences in its quality. Something more interior to it. Something that has to do with a river he grew up on, and a father who said things, and the specific memory of being somewhere else entirely. Somewhere without stone walls and approaching mornings. You don't speak. It doesn't seem like the right moment to speak. And even if it did, you have no idea what you would say. There is a category of silence that is kinder than any available words, and this is that category. After a while he says, "Do you know why I'm here? What I'm supposed to have done?" The question lands unexpectedly, though you should have expected it, or something like it. You say honestly, "I know only what comes down to the kitchen, sir, which isn't much." "No," he says, "I don't suppose it is." He eats another piece of eel. Then, "I wrote letters to a man who turned out to be writing letters to people the king considers enemies. I knew the man. I didn't know the full nature of his correspondence. That is the truth of it." A pause. "The truth of it is not particularly useful at this stage." You say nothing. There is nothing to say. The truth being or not being useful is a statement that contains its own entire world, and you're 17 and a kitchen hand, and your job tonight is to have made the food well, not to provide a response to the particular quality of Tudor political justice. Eat something, he says suddenly, looking at you. Sir, you've been standing there since you came in. You're young and you've been up all night, clearly. Have a piece of bread. You look at the manchet loaves in the basket and then back at him. The bread is for you, sir. There are 8 of them. I can't eat 8 manchet loaves. Something moves across his face. I don't intend to be hungry tomorrow. You take a manchet loaf from the basket, carefully, feeling the slight resistance of the crust and the give of the crumb beneath it. The bread still faintly warm at the centre even after 2 hours on the cooling rack. You stand with it in your hands for a moment and then, because he's watching you with an expression that says you should actually eat it rather than hold it ceremonially, you take a bite. The bread is good. The crumb is fine and even, the crust golden and slightly crisp, and the taste is the clean, slightly yeasty taste of properly made manchet. The taste of the expensive flour that went into it, and the care that went into the making. You chew and swallow and take another bite before you remember you're standing in front of a prisoner and perhaps should be doing something other than eating his bread. Good, he says, watching you eat it, and you can't tell entirely whether he means the bread or something else, the hippocras wine. He lifts the cup and holds it for a moment under his nose before drinking, the same unhurried attention he's brought to everything, and then takes a sip and makes a small sound of approval that is the most unguarded thing he's done since you walked in. Who makes this? The tower keeps its own supply? There's a stock in the lower cellar, sir. I don't know who puts it up. It's good. Better than I expected. He takes another sip. I expected something thin and oversweetened. This is actually balanced. He looks at the cup with his head slightly tilted. Cinnamon, obviously. Something deeper. Pepper? I believe so, sir, and cloves. Cloves, he nods. Yes, that's what gives it the quality. He drinks the first cup slowly. Over the course of the time it takes him to work through the dried fruits and spiced nuts, taking each one individually, holding the dried plums and figs in his palm for a moment before eating them, studying the spiced nuts with apparent genuine interest. You watch him and think about what it would be like to eat with this quality of attention every day, to bring this degree of presence to the ordinary transaction of food, and you think that most people couldn't manage it, that it requires something, some quality of focus or acceptance or both, that most people can only access in extreme circumstances, and that possibly what you're watching is not something Sir William Harwood has always had, but something he has found tonight specifically, in the room upstairs in the Beauchamp Tower, in the hours of waiting. He finds the sugar confections last. He has worked his way around the tray methodically, and now his eyes rest on the small pile of hardened rosewater pastilles, and he picks one up and holds it up toward the candlelight to look at it, and you see from across the table that it is not perfect, that it is an irregular shape and slightly thicker on one side, and you're aware of a specific anxiety about this that is entirely unreasonable given the circumstances. These are yours, he says. Not a question this time either. Yes, sir. I haven't done much sugar work. They're not as fine as they should be, sir, the shape. They're exactly what they should be, he says, and puts the pastille in his mouth. There is a pause. Rosewater, he says. Yes, sir, and cinnamon and ginger. My daughter was fond of these when she was small. We used to bring them back from the apothecary and... He stops. Something happens in his face, brief and then contained. A door opening and closing. She's in the country now. She doesn't know I'm here. Or she does by now, probably. People talk. He's quiet for a moment, eating the second pastille, and then he looks at you directly and says, How old did you say you were? 17, sir. When you're 50, he says. If you make it to 50, which in this particular century is more uncertain than it should be, when you're 50, you'll think about the meals you've cooked, the ones that mattered. Cooks do. I've spoken to enough of them to know it. They remember the occasions, the specific dishes, what went right and what didn't. He looks at the tray. This went right. I want you to know that. Your throat does something you weren't expecting. You breathe carefully through it. Thank you, sir, he nods once. He pours the second cup of hippocras himself, not waiting for you to do it, and sits back in the chair with the cup in both hands, warming them around it, and looks at the window where the sky is now definitively lighter. A grey that is beginning to have a blue edge to it. The first real suggestion of a day arriving, whether it's wanted or not. You should go, he says. The chaplain comes at 6 and I'd like a few minutes before he arrives. Yes, sir. Take the empty dishes with you. There's no reason for things to stay here that don't need to. You begin to reassemble the tray. The broth bowl is empty, every drop used. The capon dish has been well attended to, the sauce gathered up with pieces of bread, and the bones arranged neatly to one side, the way a man with manners eats a thing down to its proper conclusion. The eel dish is mostly empty, a small amount of the cooking liquid remaining, and one piece he apparently decided against. The bread basket still has 4 loaves in it. The small dishes are cleaned. The sugar confections are almost entirely gone. You fit everything back onto the tray and lift it, and it's lighter now in a way that has nothing to do with the weight of the empty dishes, but everything to do with the completed quality of it. The doneness, the meal having been what it was supposed to be. At the door you stop. You're not sure why. Something makes you turn back. Sir William Harwood is sitting with the hippocras cup in his hands, looking at the window, at the sky, and he has the expression of a man listening to something, though the room is quiet, though there is nothing to hear except the faint crackle of the brazier and the distant sound of the river, and, somewhere outside, beginning now, the first bells of the morning marking 6 o'clock at a church close enough that the sound comes in through the high windows, clear and full, one note and then the next and then the next. He doesn't look at you. He's listening to the bells. You go. The staircase is still cold, and the torch at the first landing is burned lower but not out. You navigate the curve with the tray and come out into the courtyard, and the air hits you immediately, October river air at 6 in the morning, cold enough that you can see your breath, cold in a way that is purely physical and has nothing to do with anything except temperature and your own warmth and the thinness of your apron against the wind coming in off the Thames. The sky above the tower's walls is the colour of something between grey and silver, and one cloud toward the east has caught a line of colour that is the leading edge of the sun arriving from behind the horizon, and it is almost beautiful in the specific way that early October mornings can be almost beautiful even when they are also the morning that they are. You walk back across the courtyard to the kitchen. Fletcher, at the Beauchamp Tower door, says nothing as you pass. He gives you a look that contains several things you can't fully read, something like respect or perhaps acknowledgement, and then looks back at the courtyard. Inside the kitchen, Giles is already back, arrived at his usual hour of 5:30, standing at the main fire where the breakfast preparations for the tower's general population are already underway. Porridge and bread and the salt fish that appears every morning regardless of the day. He hears you come in and looks over his shoulder. He looks at the tray in your hands. He looks at you. His expression, which is usually unreadable in the manner of someone who has spent 50 years keeping it deliberately so, does something brief and subtle that might be the expression of a man who is glad the thing is done, and equally glad he didn't have to do it. "Everything all right?" he says. "Yes, sir." He ate. "Most of it, sir. The broth was finished entirely. The capon and eels nearly so." Giles nods. He turns back to the fire. "Get some sleep," he says. "Take the cot in the back room. You're no use to me exhausted." "It's breakfast service, sir." "I have 3 other people for breakfast service. You cooked all night. Go and sleep." You set the tray down on the work table and stand there for a moment, feeling suddenly and completely how tired you are. The tiredness has been there for hours, contained by the necessity of the work, held at a manageable distance by the specific focus that a task requiring absolute attention always creates. And now that the task is done, it arrives all at once, like water through a gap in a wall, filling the spaces that the work was occupying. Your feet ache from the hours standing on stone. Your shoulders have a deep, dull burn from carrying the tray. Your left thumb, where the sugar burn is, has its own particular sharp pulse that is separate from the general tiredness, a small specific complaint. Your eyes feel the particular texture of eyes that have been open for too long in firelit rooms, slightly grainy and over-aware of light, everything looking a shade more vivid than usual, in the slightly unreal way that exhaustion sometimes produces. You go to the back room. The cot is a narrow frame with a straw mattress and a wool blanket, kept there for the occasions when someone is sick, or when a particularly late or early task requires proximity to the kitchen. You've slept on it twice before, once when you had a fever bad enough that Giles wouldn't send you back to the dormitory in case you infected the others, and once when there was a particular feast requiring a 4 a.m. start and it wasn't worth making the journey. The mattress is thin and the blanket smells of the kitchen, of fat and smoke and years of absorbed heat, but it is horizontal and it is warm, and it is the one thing in the world your body actually wants right now. You lie down with your boots on because taking them off would require effort you don't have, and you close your eyes, and the sounds of the kitchen come through the thin wall, the sounds of the morning service beginning, the fire being fed and the porridge being stirred, and the low voices of the other kitchen workers moving through their familiar routines. You lie on the cot, and you look at the ceiling, which is low and has a water stain in the shape of nothing in particular, and you think about the room you just left. You think about the way he held his hands over the broth bowl in the steam. You think about the river he grew up on, past Twickenham, and the eels that knew something the other eels didn't, and a daughter in the country who either does or doesn't know by now what this morning is. You think about him eating the sugar confections one at a time and saying they were exactly what they should be. You think about the fact that he is still up there, right now, in the room with the 2 high windows, and the sky outside those windows is getting lighter every minute, and at some point between now and the time you wake up, if you sleep, that lightening sky will have completed its transition from almost morning to morning, and the chaplain will have come and gone, and the thing will have been done in the inner ward of the Tower of London, and the world will continue. That is the fact of it. The world continues regardless. That is the thing you are learning here in this city, in this year, in this specific impossible century, that the machinery of consequence moves without reference to the specific weight of any individual morning. The broth was hot, the bread was right, the sauce was reduced correctly. These things are true, will remain true, will have been true, and they will not change anything. and they are still the right things to have done, there is something you need to understand about the way death worked in Tudor England, which is that it was not something that happened to other people. That's the thing about the England of 1535 that makes it so difficult to hold in your mind when you're sitting somewhere warm and safe 5 centuries later. Death was constant and nearby and in the room with you. The plague had not gone. It was simply between visits. Childbirth killed women at a rate that would seem extraordinary to any modern mind. Infections that are now resolved by a course of medicine you can buy at any pharmacy killed a person in 3 days of fever. Accidents in a world of unguarded fires and uneven streets and horses in confined spaces were a routine feature of life. And at the apex of all of this, the specifically Tudor innovation, was the political death, the state death, the carefully administered and publicly witnessed elimination of a person for the crime of being in the wrong place, in the wrong network of obligation, at the moment when someone more powerful needed a problem removed. Thomas More had been executed at this same tower, on this same ground, on the 6th of July of this same year, 1535, 3 months and 9 days ago. Sir Thomas More, who'd been the Lord Chancellor of England, who had written Utopia, who had been one of the most genuinely brilliant men in the country, who had simply and quietly refused to swear an oath he didn't believe, and who therefore had to stop existing. His head is on a spike on London Bridge right now, as you lie on the cot in the kitchen. This is a sentence you can read and register and still not fully absorb that a man's head is on a spike on London Bridge, because the brain makes certain accommodations with certain facts in order to continue functioning. Sir William Harwood is not Thomas More. He is a knight of middling consequence caught in a net cast for someone else, and his death, which will occur in approximately 2 hours from this moment, will be noted in documents and forgotten by most of the people living in London before the week is out. This is also how Tudor death worked. The mechanism was enormous and the individuals were small, and the mechanism continued regardless of the size of the individuals. You know all of this, in the way you know things at 17 from the accumulated hearing of conversation and the reading of the world around you. And none of it makes the room upstairs feel less present, or the sounds through the wall feel less like the sounds of something that will persist past this morning, or the smell of the broth in the now empty pot in the kitchen feel less like something that was worth making as well as you could manage. Sleep arrives suddenly, the way it does when the body has simply decided the negotiation is over. One moment you're looking at the water stain, and the next moment you're not looking at anything. You dream, though you won't remember the content of the dream, only a general quality of it. Something involving water and a kitchen that was also a different kind of room, and a man at a table who was and wasn't Sir William Harwood, and a smell you couldn't identify except that it was good. You wake up to Giles putting a cup of something hot on the floor next to the cot. It's small beer, reheated, which is the Tower Kitchen's version of a morning pick-me-up, and is exactly as good as it sounds, which is to say not good at all, but warm and wet, and containing a small amount of the general nourishment of grain, which your body accepts without complaint. You sit up. Your neck is stiff from the angle of the cot's flat pillow, which is not quite a pillow so much as a folded piece of cloth. Outside the back room, the kitchen sounds have shifted to their mid-morning register, lighter and less frantic than the breakfast rush. The fires lower, the activity more sporadic. "What time is it?" you ask. 9:30, Giles says. You're quiet for a moment. He knows what you're calculating. "It's done," he says. "An hour ago. Clean, apparently. No fuss. Clean apparently means the executioner did his job correctly, which is to say quickly and in the minimum number of strokes, which is not guaranteed, which is not even particularly common, and which in the particular hierarchy of small mercies available this morning sits at or near the top. You drink the small beer. It tastes like warm water with a suggestion of grain and a definite suggestion of something that has been in a barrel too long. You drink it anyway. The dishes are washed, Giles says. I did them when you came in. The capon dish had a particular sauce residue. The verjuice reduces to... I know what verjuice reduces to. I made a note of your technique. You let it go a touch further than I usually do. A pause. It's better that way. This is Giles Fortescue saying something that, in the currency of kitchen praise, is worth considerably more than its face value. You sit with it for a moment. Then you say, he said his mother's cook made capon with verjuice. Giles is quiet. He said you reduced it correctly, you add. He noticed. Giles says, they usually do, the ones who matter. He picks up the empty cup when you've finished and turns it in his hands once, looking at it. Get up when you're ready. There's a midday meal for the garrison at 12 and I need someone on the fish. He leaves the back room. You sit on the edge of the cot for a while longer. Your feet on the stone floor. The cold of it coming up through your boot soles. The sounds of the kitchen around you. The sounds of the tower around the kitchen. The sounds of the city around the tower. The sound of the river under all of it. Constant and is different and ongoing. An hour ago. Clean. You press your left thumb against your knee and feel the specific pulse of the burn from the sugar, which has settled from last night's sharp immediacy into a duller and more persistent ache. It will be gone in a few days. The skin will heal, the way skin does, seamlessly, leaving nothing visible. You think about the sugar confections, irregular in their shapes, hardened amber drops on parchment in the candlelit kitchen at 3 a.m, the smell of rose water rising from the copper pan. You think about him holding one up to the candlelight to look at it. They're exactly what they should be. You stand up, you tie your apron, you go back to the kitchen. The days that follow have the quality of days after a fever or after a storm, where the world is exactly what it was before, but something has shifted in you specifically, so that you move through it differently, not dramatically differently, not in ways that anyone around you would necessarily notice, but differently. You find yourself paying attention to things you'd stopped seeing. The way the morning light comes into the kitchen through the east window for exactly 40 minutes before it's blocked by the angle of the outer wall, making a particular bright rectangle on the stone floor that moves and then disappears and will not return until the same hour tomorrow. The way the bread dough changes in your hands from resistant to yielding, that specific moment about 8 minutes into the kneading, when it crosses from one state to the other and starts working with you instead of against you. The smell of the Thames at low tide coming in through the kitchen door, which is the smell of a city's entire relationship with a river compressed into something that sits at the back of the throat and stays there. You pay attention to the food differently, not more carefully exactly. You've always been careful with the food, but you pay attention to it with a kind of seriousness that has acquired a weight it didn't have before, an understanding of what it is to cook something for a reason that goes past the transaction of sustenance. Food is the most direct physical expression of care that human beings have, which is something you knew theoretically and now know in some other way, the way you know things that have been demonstrated rather than just told. You are not the same kitchen hand you were a week ago. This is not dramatic. This is just true. November comes in the way November always comes in this part of England, which is with an absolute lack of ceremony and a great deal of water. The rain arrives sometime around the first week of the month and then simply doesn't leave. It settles over the city like a decision, falling at various intensities from heavy to light, but never entirely stopping, so that every morning begins with the sound of it on the kitchen roof, and every errand into the courtyard requires the mental negotiation of whether the cold wet is going to be bad enough to warrant the heavy wool coat, or whether you'll simply accept being moderately damp for the duration. The Thames responds to November by becoming something more serious. All year it's been a working river, busy and commercial and slightly irritating to cross, but in November it shows you what it actually is, which is a tidal body of enormous power that is permitting the city to exist on its banks as a courtesy it can revoke at any point. The water rises with the tide to levels that, in wet years, lap at the lower steps of the riverside stairs and occasionally overtake them entirely. The current through the bridge arches accelerates to something that even the experienced watermen approach with visible respect. On grey days, when the fog comes off the water and sits in the courtyard until mid-morning, the tower feels less like a building and more like something that emerged from the river itself, stone pulled up from the riverbed, shaped by the same forces that shape the banks. You learn the tower in November in a way you didn't quite learn it in the milder months. Learn its particular thermal qualities. The way the inner ward is always colder than it should be, because the walls block the sun for most of the short winter day. The way the kitchen retains heat long after the fires drop because of the particular depth of its stone. The way your breath clouds in the stairwells where the cold air pools like water finding its level. The kitchen's seasonal rhythm changes. The summer produce is gone. The fresh herbs stripped back to their woody stems, the vegetables shifting from the green variety of the warmer months to the root vegetables that store through winter, turnips and parsnips and onions and the dried peas and beans that come out of the barrels along the cold larder wall. Meat changes too. The summer's salted and dried provisions give way to the freshly slaughtered animals that November brings. The killing of livestock that can't be fed through winter, the salting and smoking and preserving work that fills the kitchen with additional smells and additional tasks and an additional register of urgency, because preservation done badly is food that kills rather than sustains. You learn to salt. Giles stands over you the first time and watches with his particular quality of attention that looks like indifference but isn't, and corrects the ratio without raising his voice, and then corrects it again the following week, and then the week after that nods at a rack of salt pork that you have done correctly, which is his way of saying that you have done correctly. You learn to smoke. The smokehouse attached to the north end of the kitchen building is a narrow stone room with a fire pit and a grate above it, and hooks in the ceiling, and a specific smell that works its way into everything within 20 feet of it, including your hair and the wool of your coat, and apparently the pages of any book left open in the adjacent corridor. The fish go in first, the eels and the herrings and the sprats from the river, and then the meats, and the process is slow and requires monitoring and teaches you something about patience that is different from the patience of sauces, less subtle, more physical. The patience of a fire that must be maintained at exactly the right temperature for hours, not too hot and not too cool. The smoke doing its work at its own pace regardless of how you feel about how long it's taking. You learn the spice cabinet with new depth in November, because November is when the spice preparations become important in a way they aren't in summer, when the warmth of cinnamon and ginger and cloves serves not just as flavour, but as a kind of physical argument against the cold. Giles opens the spice cabinet one afternoon and shows you the full inventory, naming each thing, telling you where it comes from and what it costs and which dishes use it, and what happens to a dish when you use too much or too little of each one. The cinnamon comes from Ceylon, which is an island south of India that you know approximately nothing about except that it produces cinnamon of the particular quality that makes the air smell like something worth being cold for. It has been on a ship, this cinnamon, has been carried across seas you've never seen in quantities that somebody calculated would justify the journey, has passed through the hands of Venetian merchants and Portuguese traders and Antwerp middlemen before arriving in London in a sack that was then broken down into smaller sacks and sold to spice merchants in the city who sold to the Tower's provisioner, who put it in this jar on this shelf in this kitchen, where you are now standing with your nose over it, breathing in something that smells like half the world. The nutmeg comes from islands further east, called the Moluccas, which are so remote that the men who trade in them are doing something that is less commerce and more adventure, or more accurately something that is adventure dressed up in the language of commerce, because adventure alone is harder to finance. The nutmeg is hard and dark, the individual nuts fitting in the palm of your hand with a smooth, dense weight, and the smell when you grate them on the small iron grater is immediate and complex, warm and slightly sweet with an edge that sits behind your eyes when you inhale it too closely. You hold a nutmeg and think about how far it has come to be here. You think about the ship that carried it, the weather that ship encountered, the men aboard who may or may not have survived the journey, and the particular series of transactions and decisions and accidents that resulted in this specific nutmeg ending up in your specific hand, in this specific kitchen, in this specific city, on the bank of this specific river, on this November afternoon. Giles says, the cloves from the same area, the pepper from India, south coast, brought by the Portuguese, the ginger from further still, dried, not fresh, though in the better houses they'll get fresh ginger in season. He holds up a piece of dried ginger, pale yellow and nobbled, with the faintly dusty smell of something that was something else once, and has been preserved into this particular form. The sugar from Madeira, the saffron from Spain, the mace from the same tree as the nutmeg, different part. He puts everything back, each jar in its place, and closes the cabinet. Everything in this kitchen, he says, came from somewhere else. That's the thing you need to understand. Every significant ingredient arrived at this kitchen from a distance that most people in England will never travel in their lives. The cooking you do here is a physical record of how far the world reaches into this building. He looks at you. That should mean something to how you handle it. It does mean something. You're not sure you can say precisely what it means, but it settles into you and stays there. The understanding that what you're doing in this kitchen is not separate from the larger world, but continuous with it. Part of the same system that moves things from where they are to where they're needed. That makes the specific quality of this meal possible because a sailor you'll never meet didn't die in a storm you'll never know about. December arrives and the cold becomes something you don't adjust to so much as incorporate. The way you incorporate a persistent noise by learning to hear past it. The morning ritual of breaking the ice in the washing basin becomes automatic, your fist coming down on it before you're fully awake. The cold water on your face performing the function of convincing your body that being conscious is the appropriate state. The kitchen is warm by the time you get downstairs, Giles or one of the others having built the fires up from their overnight state. And the transition from cold to warm as you come through the door is the best moment of most winter mornings. A physical relief that you've noticed you can't take for granted the way you might have at the beginning. when you were 15 and hadn't yet spent a year in an unheated dormitory above a stone kitchen. The other kitchen workers in this period of your life are John Hale, who is 22 and has been here 4 years and has the comfortable competence of someone who knows his environment thoroughly and has made a private peace with its limitations. Margaret Brew, who is the only woman in the kitchen proper and who does the bread and pastry work with a focus and a precision that makes you slightly competitive in a way you've never fully acknowledged. An older man named Robert Cates, who handles the fish and the smoking and rarely speaks, but whose sense of smell is approximately as acute as Giles's own. And 2 boys younger than you, both new in the last year, both at the stage of learning that you remember being at, the stage where everything requires conscious thought and the hands haven't yet developed their own memory. You teach them things sometimes, small things, the things that Giles has taught you, passed on in the same manner they were given to you, without ceremony in the course of the work. Not so tight, you tell the younger one, a 12-year-old named Will with ears that are slightly too large for his head and an expression of permanent anxious concentration. He's working a piece of dough that is resisting him because he's gripping it too firmly, fighting it rather than working with it. The dough pushes back if you push too hard. You want to coax it. Will looks at you with the expression of someone who finds the instruction inadequate but is willing to try it. He adjusts his grip. The dough responds. His expression shifts. There, you say. He nods, going back to work, and you watch for a moment with something you recognize after a short delay as the specific satisfaction of having given someone something useful, which is a feeling adjacent to the satisfaction of having made something good, close enough to be related, different enough to be its own thing. You think about Sir William Harwood saying the sauce was reduced correctly. You think about Giles saying it was better your way. Teaching is a continuation of being taught, which is a continuation of being given something worth passing on. The chain goes back further than you can see. Some cook in some kitchen 100 years ago learned the correct way to reduce verjuice sauce and taught it to someone who taught it to someone who eventually taught it to Giles, who taught it to you, who are now thinking about the best way to explain it to a 12-year-old who has no idea yet that what he's learning today he'll still be using in 30 years. There are 6 prisoners in the Tower in December of 1535. You don't know most of their names. The food goes up and the plates come back down and the transaction is complete and contained. But you are now aware of it in a way you weren't before October, aware that the dishes going up represent something that goes past the nutritional transaction of feeding a body. One morning in the 3rd week of December, you're sent to the cold larder for salt pork and you take the wrong cask. Not wrong exactly, but a less good cask, the one from the back that was open last, and Giles finds this out by tasting a piece of the resulting pottage and says nothing but takes the cask you opened and carries it to the back himself, and comes back with the other one, the front cask, the better quality one, and sets it down on the preparation table without speaking, and goes back to what he was doing. You stand with the inferior cask in front of you and feel the specific texture of being corrected through silence, which is worse than being corrected through words because you have to do all the interpretive work yourself. The front cask is better quality, you say. The provisioner gives us 2 grades, Giles says, not turning around. Front for the general table, back for the everyday kitchen work. Same principle as the spice cabinet. You know the principle. Yes, sir. The cask you took is fine for a morning potage for the garrison. It's not the cask for a midday meal that's going to the resident officers. I'll remember. You'll remember, he agrees. This is a category of knowledge that Giles doesn't always make explicit, and that you acquire partly by making mistakes and partly by paying attention to what he does, rather than only to what he says. The tower operates on a hierarchy of provision that runs from the constable's table at the top to the garrison soldier's breakfast at the bottom, and every meal sits somewhere in that hierarchy, and the quality of the ingredients used reflects where it sits, and knowing exactly which meal is at which level on any given day requires a continuous awareness of who is in the tower, what they're entitled to, and what the current provision allows. It's not unlike the social mathematics of the streets you learned when you first arrived at 15 from the house in Cheapside, the constant calibration of who gets what and why and how much, the way the city's entire system is built on gradations of entitlement that everyone understands and no one explicitly teaches. You learn it by living inside it. You learn it by watching what happens when you get it wrong. Christmas in the Tower of London in 1535 is a genuine event. Not a modest observance, but a full 12 days of it, beginning on Christmas Day and running through to Epiphany on the 6th of January, with the kitchen operating at the elevated intensity of a building that takes its celebrations seriously and has the provision and the staff to support them. Henry VIII, who is at this point 44 years old, and in the specific phase of his reign that historians will later call the Middle Period, though nobody knows that now, has a particular relationship with celebration that could be described as enthusiastic or as obligatory depending on your perspective, and the celebration radiates outward from the court at Whitehall into every institution associated with the crown, of which the Tower is very much one. You've never cooked for Christmas at the Tower before. Your 2 previous Christmases here were spent doing the work as directed, without the full picture of what the work was building toward. This year Giles decides, without announcement, to let you see the whole of it. He begins in the last week of November with the planning. He sits at the small table in the back room in the evenings with his ledger and his list and his years of institutional knowledge, and works out the entire provision for 12 days of elevated service, the meats and the birds and the fish and the pastry and the sauces and the spiced wines and the confections, calculating quantities against the number of people to be served, the available storage, the expected deliveries, the contingencies. He shows you the ledger. He explains the calculations. He walks you through the reasoning behind each decision, the way you plan backwards from the date of service, allowing time for preparation and storage and the inevitable failures, the batch of something that doesn't set correctly, the delivery that arrives late, the bird that turns out to have been stored too long. Christmas Day, he says, running his finger down the list. Main hall service, the constable's table and the officer tables, swan, if the provisionary has the order in, and capon and beef served with the spiced sauce we discussed, mince pies, the almond custard you made in November that came out well, the hippocras, obviously, marchpane for the high table. Marchpane is the sugar and almond confection that is the apex of the confectioner's art in this period, served at high tables as both food and status symbol, sometimes formed into elaborate architectural shapes, sometimes painted with saffron-coloured decoration, always expensive and always noticed. You've made it once in a practice session Giles arranged in October, and the result was acceptable, but not good enough for a Christmas high table. I'll need more practice, you say. You have 3 weeks, he makes a note. I'll walk you through it twice more and then you'll do it on your own. The practice sessions happen in the evenings after the main kitchen work is done, when the fires are lower and the room is quieter and Giles has the patience to go slowly. The marchpane requires a precise ratio of ground almonds to sugar, worked together with rosewater until they form a paste that holds its shape when pressed, but doesn't crumble when moved. The texture is critical. Too dry, and it cracks when you try to shape it. Too wet, and it won't hold. The margin between these states is narrow and requires the specific knowledge that is in your hands rather than your head. The feel of the paste between your palms as you work it. The point where it starts to say yes instead of no. The first practice session produces something that Giles tastes without expression and then pushes away. Too wet. You added the rosewater too fast. The almonds need time to absorb it before you assess whether you need more. The second session produces something better, the texture closer, the shaping more controlled. Giles tastes it and says, better. The shape is uneven. Practice the forming. The third session, 2 weeks before Christmas, produces something that Giles tastes and then tastes again from a different part, and then sets the piece down and looks at it for a moment and says, that's the right texture. The flavour is correct. You'll do the Christmas batch. You do not say anything because anything you said would be inadequate to the feeling, which is the feeling of having been found equal to a thing that mattered. Christmas Day itself is a controlled chaos that begins at 4 a.m. and does not conclude until 10 p.m, when the last service is cleared and the last pan is washed, and Giles sits down on the stool by the east fire and drinks a cup of ale with the expression of a man who has once again done a thing that required everything and survived it. The kitchen smells by the end of the day of the sum of every dish made in it, a complex and dense and strangely magnificent smell that is the smell of a full day's serious cooking, layered and rich and warm, the specific atmosphere of a room where many things were made at once over many hours. The marchpane went to the constable's table on a plate Margaret lined with a piece of green cloth to make the pale shapes show against something. You shaped them as stars, which was safer than attempting anything architectural. 5 points on each one, pressed out with a small wooden form you carved in the first week of December for exactly this purpose. The surface slightly smoothed and glazed with a beaten egg white that gives it its particular sheen. You didn't see them arrive at the table. You were in the kitchen when the service was carried up. But Giles told you, 2 days later, that the constable had inquired who made the marchpane, and Giles had said Thomas Apsley, his apprentice, and the constable had nodded and said it was well made, and that was the end of that conversation, which is exactly how praise works in this environment, distributed economically, and at a distance, and for exactly as long as it takes to say it, no longer, still. The constable said it was well made. You carry this for several days in the particular careful way that you carry things that matter without wanting to damage them by holding them too tightly, turning it over occasionally like a coin, feeling its weight. The new year arrives without ceremony. January the 1st of 1536 has no particular status as a date. The new year in England is formally reckoned to begin on the 25th of March, which is Lady Day, the feast of the Annunciation, and the 1st of January is simply the day after the 31st of December, notable mainly for being colder than Christmas was, and for the particular quality of stillness that follows an extended celebration. The city quieter than usual, the streets less crowded, people recovering. In the Tower kitchen you are recovering from Christmas service by doing the opposite of elaborate cooking. The simple restorative work of clear broths and plain roasted things and the bread routine that runs regardless of the season. There is something genuinely pleasant about this. the simplicity of it after the weeks of escalating complexity, the return to the basic transactions of heat and raw material and time. You think about the coming year in the way that people always think about coming years, with a combination of intention and uncertainty that resolves into neither planning nor worry, but something between them, a kind of watchful openness. What you know about 1536, which is to say what you know right now in this kitchen, on this January morning, is that you are in your third year of apprenticeship, which means you have something between 5 and 7 years left, depending on how Giles and the Tower's arrangements define the conclusion, and that when it ends you will be a journeyman cook with genuine skills and a genuine reference, and the ability to work in any kitchen in London. That is the future you can see from here. The rest of it is the weather that doesn't exist yet. What you don't know, because you couldn't know, because nobody in England knows yet in January of 1536, is what the year will actually contain. January passes, February passes. The cold sustains itself through both months with the particular stubbornness of an English winter that has decided not to be hurried, and the kitchen continues its rhythm, and you continue learning, and the Tower continues being the Tower. It is on the 29th of April, a Wednesday, that everything changes. Not for you specifically, for England. The news comes into the Tower like all significant news comes into the Tower, which is quickly and from several directions at once and in versions that are not entirely consistent with each other, and then resolves itself over the following hours into a fact that everyone agrees on because it can't be disagreed with any longer. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, has been arrested. You're at the East Fire when you hear it, working on a midday service sauce, and you hear it first from John Hale, who heard it from the warder at the kitchen door, who had it from one of the garrison soldiers, who had it from a man who arrived by boat from the city an hour earlier. By the time it reaches you, it has the quality of news that has been passed through multiple sets of hands, and yet retained its essential shape, because the essential shape of it is so large and so impossible that there's no room to embellish it further. The Queen in the Tower. You stand at the fire with the sauce spoon in your hand, and you think about the last time someone notable arrived in the Tower and what it meant, and you think about October, and a room with 2 high windows and a man holding a piece of sugar confection up to the candlelight, and you think about what it means that this building is the place where England sends the people. It has decided are problems to be solved. Giles is at the main fire. His back is to you. He makes no reaction to the news when it arrives, which is either because he already knew, or because this is Giles, and his reaction to extraordinary information is the same as his reaction to ordinary information, which is to continue doing whatever he was doing. You watch the back of his head for a moment, and then you watch the sauce and stir it and think. Anne Boleyn is 28 years old, or 29, the exact year of her birth being one of those historical facts that was uncertain even to the people who were alive at the time. She has been Queen of England for 3 years. She is the reason Henry VIII separated England from the Catholic Church, which is to say she is the reason an entire country changed its relationship with God, or at least with the institutional expression of that relationship, which, depending on your perspective, is either the same thing or a completely different thing. She is the reason Thomas More is dead, because More refused to recognise the legitimacy of Henry's marriage to her. She has a daughter named Elizabeth, who is 2 years old, who is at this point in her life living at Hatfield House, and who is not, as yet, any particular kind of symbol to anyone. In 3.5 weeks, Anne Boleyn will be dead. You don't know that yet either, but you know that she is here, in the Tower, on the other side of the stone walls of the kitchen. in the same building where you're standing, stirring a sauce with a spoon your father gave you, and the sauce smells like reduced stock and bay, and something faintly sweet from the wine you added 10 minutes ago, and the fire is warm on your left side and cold on your right, and the world has shifted into some new configuration whose shape you can't yet see. Her food will come from this kitchen. That knowledge arrives slowly and then completely. The food she eats in the tower, whatever she eats, whenever she eats it, will be made here. Will pass through these hands or hands like them. Will go from fire to pot to dish to tray to room. The same transaction it always is, regardless of who is waiting at the end of it. That night, lying on your actual bed in the dormitory above the kitchen rather than the cot in the back room, you look at the low ceiling with its familiar water stain, and you think about a question that has no clean answer, which is whether the act of making food for someone is a neutral act regardless of what is happening to that person, or whether it takes on a quality from its context. Whether the broth you made for Sir William Harwood was a different kind of thing because of what the morning contained. You think about your father, who cooked in a house in Cheapside and made food for people, and never, as far as you know, thought about it in these terms, who made it because it was his job and because he was good at it and because food needed making. You think about whether that's the right approach, the correct relationship to the work, or whether the approach you've accidentally arrived at, which involves too much thinking about what the food means, is useful or just painful. You don't arrive at a conclusion. This is appropriate. Some questions don't arrive at conclusions. They just get carried, and you develop the capacity to carry them without being defined by them. The ceiling has a water stain in the shape of nothing in particular. Sleep comes eventually. The kitchen in the following weeks operates at a level of heightened awareness that is different from its usual state. Not different in its tasks, which are the same tasks they always are, but different in the quality of attention brought to them, the way the whole building runs slightly more carefully when it contains someone significant. The way the warder checks the gate twice instead of once. The way conversations in the courtyard happen in lower voices than they did a month ago. Anne Boleyn's meals are prepared not by you, but by Margaret Brew and Robert Cates, and, on the most formal occasions, by Giles himself. The food she receives is appropriate to her station, which is still technically Queen of England, even though she's imprisoned, which creates a logistical situation that the tower navigates by applying the same principle it applies to everything, which is that station determines provision regardless of circumstance. You see the trays going up sometimes. They are different from the trays you assembled for Sir William Harwood, more elaborate, more carefully arranged. The dish is better quality. She has her own servants with her who assist with the service, which means the trays arrive at a door and are received rather than carried to a table and set down. You hear from fragments of conversation that drift through the kitchen that she is talking, a lot, that she says things that are written down by the lieutenant's men, that she cries sometimes and laughs at other things, that she is frightened and also somehow composed in the way of a person who's been preparing for something without admitting to themselves that they were preparing for it. You hear that she asked for the sacrament, that she is praying constantly, that she said to the lieutenant of the tower that she believed she would be condemned not because she was guilty of what she was charged with, but because the king wished it so. Whether this is true or not is a question that 5 centuries of historians will argue about and never resolve to everyone's satisfaction. What you know is that she is in the building and the building is carrying her towards something, and that the kitchen will continue making food regardless of what that something is. On the morning of the 19th of May, you wake up and the day has that quality again, the one you first learned in October, the quality of a day that contains something that is going to happen, the pre-event atmosphere, the specific tension of a building holding its breath. You know by now what this quality means. You go downstairs and light the fire and start the bread. The bread is always started first, because bread requires time that the other preparations don't. The rising and the proving, and the time in the oven, the living chemistry of yeast that can't be hurried regardless of anything else. You measure the flour into the bowl with practiced hands, the specific quantity that you know produces the right number of loaves, and you add the water and the yeast, and you begin to mix, and the smell of the flour rising around you is the clean dust smell of grain, the smell of something that will become something else. And your hands go into the dough the way they have gone into hundreds of batches of dough before, and the familiar resistance of it is there, and then the familiar yielding, and you knead, without thinking about it, because this is the work, and the work is what there is. Outside you can hear the city. The tower stands close enough to the river that you can always hear it. The boat traffic, the calls of the watermen, the general noise of London going about its business, which London does regardless of what is happening inside any particular building. London in 1536 is home to approximately 70,000 people, which by the standards of European cities is not enormous, but by the standards of England is the entire world compressed into one place, and the noise of it is a constant, low, continuous roar like something breathing. It's a different noise today. You notice this while your hands are in the dough, without looking up, without changing what you're doing. The street sounds from beyond the walls have a different texture, something more concentrated about them, the way a crowd sounds different from a collection of people, each doing their own thing, the difference between individual noise and collective attention. They've come to see it. Of course they have. They come for these things, they always come. London has always come, would have come for this one specifically given who it involves. The crowd outside the tower walls is made up of people who got up this morning and walked here and are now standing as close as they're permitted to get, which is not close at all, but is close enough to say they were present, which is a thing that matters to people in ways that logic doesn't quite account for. You knead the dough. Giles comes in at his usual time and goes to the main fire and starts the porridge, and the two of you work in the same space without speaking, and the kitchen smells of dough and fire and the particular cold morning smell that fades once the fires are properly up. At some point in the early morning, you hear the crowd noise change. You hear it shift from the low murmur of waiting to something else, a collective sound that has no exact English word, something between a gasp and a cheer, and a grief that is so large it becomes its own noise, and then it settles back into something quieter and continuous, and then eventually fades as the people begin to leave. "It's done. You put the bread in the oven," Giles says. "The officer's breakfast needs the smoked fish from the rack. Take 3 of the thicker ones." "Yes, sir." You go to the smokehouse and find the fish by touch in the dim light, feeling along the rack for the weight and thickness of each one, selecting by hand, and the smell in the smokehouse is the smell of preservation, of something being held in its current state against the tendency of all things to change and diminish. The smoke having done its work, the salt having done its work, the cold air doing its work, and the fish staying fish. You bring them back to the kitchen and lay them on the board and get the knife out and begin to break them down for the morning service. And outside the walls of the tower the crowd continues to disperse, returning to its component individuals who each go back to their separate lives and their separate kitchens and their separate days. The grass in the inner ward will be kept short. The stones will be washed. The building will continue. You are 18 years old. You have been here 3 years. You have cooked for a man in his last hours and watched the world move past it and kept making bread. You know how to reduce a sauce and break down a bird and balance a spice and read the heat of a fire by sound and smell before you get close enough to feel it. You know which cask is for which table and which prisoner gets which quality of provision, and how to carry a heavy tray up a stone staircase in the dark without spilling anything. You know how to make something that tastes like something worth eating, which is more than you knew 3 years ago, and it will still be true tomorrow. The fish comes apart cleanly under the knife. The smell of it rises, smoked and salt, the smell of the Thames and of preservation, and of the work of many hands over many days that resulted in this particular fish on this particular board at this particular hour. The fire crackles. Outside, London goes about its business. The bread is rising in the oven. Summer comes in June and means something different inside the tower than it does outside it. Inside, the heat catches in the stone of the inner ward and sits there, the walls absorbing it during the day and releasing it at night in the wrong order, so that midday in the kitchen is brutally hot and 2 in the morning is warmer than it should be, and the fires that are a comfort in winter become something you manage around rather than toward. You learn to cook in the early morning hours before the day's heat peaks, and to do the cold work in the afternoons when the temperature of the larder is fighting against you, but at least isn't being actively worsened by additional fire. The smell of the tower in summer is different from the smell of the tower in winter. In winter the smell is contained, held close by the cold, wood smoke and meat, and damp stone. In summer it expands, the river smell coming off the Thames in waves that vary with the tide and the wind direction, sometimes simply briny and alive in the way of moving water, and sometimes, on still days when the tide is low and the sun has been on the exposed mud for several hours, something considerably more emphatic than that. The Thames in the 16th century is doing many jobs simultaneously, being a highway and a water source and a sewer and a fishing ground and a commercial artery, and on hot August days the sewer function asserts itself with a conviction that overrides most of the others. You've been inside the tower for 3 months with barely an hour outside its walls, the winter and spring having been so busy that leaving the building was something that happened in theory but rarely in practice, a quick errand to the water stairs and back, a delivery to the gate and back, never any distance, never any real engagement with the city that exists on the other side of the stone walls and the moat. It's Giles who sends you out in the first week of July. He comes to you one morning with a list in his hand and says, "The Billingsgate Fish Market, the Spice Merchants on Cornhill, and the Dry Goods Warehouse in Gracechurch Street. The Tower's provisioner is behind on 3 deliveries, and I need these things today." He hands you the list and a leather purse that feels substantial, in a way that means you're carrying real money, a fact that produces a particular alertness in the back of your neck that is both the consciousness of responsibility and something more primitive than that, the awareness that you are carrying something worth taking. "Take the water stairs to the bridge," he says. "Don't walk through the streets with the purse showing, and don't buy anything that isn't on the list." "Yes, sir." "Don't be late." "Yes, sir." The morning is already warm when you cross the courtyard toward the Watergate, the sun not yet at its height but already doing serious work, and the smell of the river is coming in over the wall with a confidence that suggests today is going to be one of the more emphatic days for the Thames sewer function. You're aware, stepping through the gate and onto the landing stairs, of a feeling in your chest that you recognise after a moment as something simple and slightly embarrassing, which is the feeling of being outside and of the day being large in a way it isn't inside stone walls. The sky from the landing stairs is an actual sky, not a rectangle of sky seen through a courtyard opening, and the Thames in front of you is wide and moving and full of boats and smells and noise, and London is on both banks of it, and you are 18 years old and you have a leather purse and a list and the entire morning. The waterman at the stairs is a lean man of indeterminate age, somewhere between 35 and 60, with hands that have gripped oars for so long they seem to have formed around them, and he looks at you as you come down the steps with the practiced assessment of someone who has spent years reading the quality of a potential passenger in a glance. Where to? Billingsgate Stairs. He nods. You negotiate the fare, which is twopence, and step into the wherry, and the boat rocks slightly under your weight with a rocking that is fundamentally different from solid ground, something the body never entirely makes peace with even after years of occasionally crossing rivers, a reminder that the surface you're on has no particular interest in keeping you upright. The waterman pushes off, and the tower begins to move away from you, or rather, you begin to move away from the tower. Though from inside the boat the sensation is of the tower retreating, its high stone walls diminishing slowly as the wherry finds the current and begins to move downstream. You watch it go. 3 years you've lived inside those walls, and this is the first time you've seen the outside of them properly. The whole profile of it, the white tower at the centre, with its 4 corner turrets, the outer walls running down to the water, the Lion Tower and the Middle Tower and the Byward Tower, making the western entrance into a layered fortification that announces its seriousness before you even reach the gate. It is a serious place. From the outside it looks exactly as serious as it is. It looks like a place where things happen and then are not undone. You turn away from it and face downriver, toward the city, and the city is there. London in July of 1536 is home to approximately 70,000 people, and the evidence of those 70,000 people is everywhere you look. The buildings crowding the north bank all the way down to the water's edge, the wharves and warehouses and stairs projecting into the river at irregular intervals, boats tied up at the landing stages and others moving on the water in every direction. The noise of it all coming across the surface of the river with the particular carrying quality of sound over water, cleaner and more distinct than the same sounds would be in a street. You are travelling approximately half a mile, Billingsgate being just west of the bridge, and the waterman rows with the long, easy strokes of someone who has made this journey several thousand times and sees no reason to hurry. You watch the city go by on the north bank and the south bank and overhead, because the sky above the river is populated too, with gulls mostly, following the boats with professional interest, and occasional larger birds working the air currents in slow spirals over the water. The smell changes as you approach Billingsgate. Billingsgate is London's primary fish market, has been for longer than anyone can precisely remember, and it announces itself from a considerable distance with a smell that is simultaneously the smell of the sea and the smell of what happens to the sea's contents when they've been out of it for various amounts of time. It is not an unpleasant smell exactly, but it is a large one, a smell with a personality. The kind of smell that you'd be able to identify in darkness from 50 yards without any assistance. The landing stage at Billingsgate Stairs is busy with the morning's trade, boats tied up 4 deep in places, men moving cargo in both directions with the controlled urgency of commerce that has been running at this pace since before dawn and will continue long after you've gone. You pay the waterman and step off, and immediately the smell intensifies, the fish market being directly above and behind the stairs, and the noise intensifies too. The specific noise of a market that has things to sell, and people who need to buy them, and a limited amount of morning to accomplish this transaction in. Billingsgate Market in July is a place of extraordinary sensory density. The stalls run in rows under and around a series of buildings that have been there long enough to have acquired their own particular atmosphere. The walls stained with years of fish handling. The ground underfoot slick in a way that is partly water and partly something that doesn't bear thinking about too precisely. Every kind of fish that the Thames and the North Sea and the channels of England can produce is here in some form, fresh and salt and smoked and dried, laid out on boards and in baskets and in barrels, the sellers announcing their wares in the continuous overlapping shout that is the sound of a London market in full operation. You navigate it with the list in your hand, comparing what you need against what's on offer, and you discover that you are doing, in miniature, the same calculation you do in the kitchen, assessing quality against price against the specific requirements of what you're making, except that here the assessment has to happen in seconds rather than minutes, because the man at the next stall is already looking at your fish, and if you take too long, someone else will take it. The sole is good today, firm and bright-eyed, still smelling of the sea rather than of the market, and you buy 2 dozen at a price that is slightly above what you wanted to pay, but below what you were prepared to. The mackerel are less good, caught yesterday rather than this morning by the look of them, and you say so to the seller, who takes mild offence and gestures at his entire stock as evidence of its excellence, and you point at the specific dullness around the gills of the fish in question, which is the visible evidence of your position, and he looks at them and looks at you and drops his price, and you buy 8. You have been in the market for 20 minutes, and already your coat carries the ambient smell of Billingsgate, which is not something that will leave it today regardless of how much distance you put between yourself and the fish. This is a fact of the market that everyone who visits it knows and accepts, the smell being part of the price of admission. The spice merchants on Cornhill are a 15-minute walk from Billingsgate, north through the streets of the city, and the walk is London, which is to say it is everything at once. The streets in the city proper are not the streets around the Tower, which have a certain functional quality to them. The streets of a working institution with specific traffic between specific points. These are streets that have been doing whatever they wanted for several hundred years, and carry the evidence of it in their layout, which makes no concessions to legibility or ease of navigation, twisting and narrowing and widening, and occasionally simply stopping in ways that seem designed to confuse anyone who hasn't memorized them from childhood. The noise is the first thing that hits you when you leave the relative open space of the waterfront and enter the streets properly. It's layered in a way that the Tower's noise isn't. The sheer number of simultaneous conversations and arguments and transactions, creating something closer to a roar than to anything distinguishable, and then within that roar, if you focus, you can pull out individual threads. A woman at a window above calling down to someone in the street below. 2 men debating something with the intensity of a dispute that has been ongoing for some time. A vendor somewhere around a corner whose particular cry you can't make out, but whose rhythm is the rhythm of professional repetition. The smell of the city in July is something that requires a certain adjustment of expectations. London smells like London, which is a compound of the river and the coal smoke that sits in a permanent haze over the rooftops, and the several thousand horses whose contribution to the street environment is both literal and olfactory, and the specific variety of human density that comes from putting 70,000 people in a space designed for considerably fewer, all of it mixed together and concentrated by the summer heat into something that is simply the smell of this place, as specific as the smell of a person's house, as unmistakable and as impossible to replicate anywhere else. You've been in London since you were 15, but you've been largely inside a building, and the city you're walking through now is something more than the city you've seen from the tower's walls or glimpsed on quick errands to the gate. This is the city at full operation, all of it happening at once, the commerce and the argument and the movement and the noise and the smell, and you walk through it with your leather purse inside your coat and your list in your hand and your eyes moving across everything, and you feel something expanding in your chest that is the specific response of a person who's been contained in a small space for a long time, suddenly finding themselves in something much larger. Cornhill is one of the streets where the spice and grocery trade concentrates itself, and you find it by the smell before you see the signs. The complex aromatic atmosphere of a street where multiple merchants are handling pepper and cinnamon and cloves and ginger in commercial quantities, which produces an olfactory environment so different from the fish market 2 streets away that the transition between them requires an actual moment of adjustment, your nose recalibrating between one intense and particular smell and another. The merchant you need is Alderman Brews, who is on the Tower's Provisioners Approved list and who Giles has dealt with for 12 years. His shop is a narrow frontage that opens into a surprisingly deep interior. The walls lined with wooden shelves holding the ceramic jars and paper packages and cloth sacks that contain everything the kitchen needs and cannot make itself. The smell inside the shop is the smell of the spice cabinet in the Tower kitchen multiplied enormously, as if someone has taken everything you know about those jars and expanded it to fill a room. A young man behind the counter looks at your list and goes to the shelves with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly where everything is, measuring and wrapping with practice speed. You watch and calculate prices in your head, checking them against what Giles said to expect, which is within range, though not identical because the market fluctuates and always has. The nutmegs are up from last month, you say. The young man glances at you. Portuguese supply's been irregular, ship delayed. How long delayed? Could be another month, could be resolved next week. Nobody knows. He wraps the nutmegs. If you want guaranteed price, your master should look at the Dutch merchants on Friday mornings at the steel yard. They sometimes have stock that bypasses the main channel. This is useful information. You file it away in the category of things Giles doesn't know yet, which is a small category, but one you're always looking to add to. I'll tell him, you say. You pay for the spices and pack them into the canvas bag you brought for the purpose, the weight of them settling onto your shoulder as a comfortable density of things that matter. The dry goods warehouse on Gracechurch Street is the final stop, and the walk there takes you through the heart of the city, through Lombard Street where the money changers and the goldsmiths operate behind their own particular shop fronts, and past the church of St. Edmund, King and Martyr, which is a small church sitting improbably in the middle of the commercial traffic, as if to remind everyone that not everything that matters can be bought, and then into Gracechurch Street itself, which is broad enough to take traffic in both directions and does, the 2 streams of carts and horses and pedestrians negotiating their passage in an ongoing negotiation that works mostly through the accumulated habit of people doing it every day. And then you see it. London Bridge. You've crossed it. Everyone who's spent any time in this city has crossed it, but you've always crossed it without stopping, going from one side to the other with a specific destination on the far end, and no time to actually look at what you're walking through. From here, from the northern approach, you can see the whole profile of it. the buildings rising up on both sides of the roadway like a canyon of timber and plaster, 4 and 5 stories high, leaning out over the roadway so far in places that the upper floors nearly touch, creating roofed passages where daylight barely reaches the cobblestones below. It doesn't look like a bridge. It looks like a street that has been stretched over a river and told to hold. The traffic on the bridge is continuous. Carts and horses and pedestrians moving in both directions through the narrow road between the buildings, and you can hear it from here. The particular acoustic effect of all that movement inside the canyon of the buildings, a sound that bounces off surfaces and comes back to itself, and creates something more concentrated and complex than the same traffic would sound on an open street. You have everything you need. Giles said to be back by midday. You have perhaps an hour. You walk toward the bridge. The approach is through a gate at the northern end, the Great Stone Gate, which is a substantial piece of architecture in its own right. 2 stories of stone above the roadway with the city's coat of arms above the arch. You pass through it and you're on the bridge, and the effect is immediately claustrophobic in the specific way of a space that was not designed with your comfort in mind. The roadway between the buildings is perhaps 12 feet wide, which means that when a cart is coming one way and a horse is coming the other way, and there are pedestrians on both sides, and a man with a barrow has stopped to make a delivery to one of the ground floor shops, the remaining navigable passage is approximately the width of your shoulders. You've heard that accidents on the bridge happen regularly, that people are knocked into walls and occasionally into worse situations, and you understand it immediately from the inside. You press close to the left-hand buildings and move with a flow of pedestrians going south, and the bridge does what it does to everyone who crosses it for the first time paying actual attention, which is to disorient you completely. You're not in the open air, you're not exactly inside. You're in something that is both, a covered street that is also a bridge that is also a community of perhaps 200 people who live and trade in these buildings perched above a tidal river. You pass a hosier's shop on your left where the proprietor is hanging a display of stockings on hooks outside the door in a way that requires you to duck slightly to avoid them. You pass a narrow house where someone has propped a window open on the upper floor, and from it comes the smell of cooking, mid-morning cooking, something with onions, someone up there making something ordinary and domestic in a room that is suspended over the Thames. You pass a haberdasher and a bookshop, and what appears to be a tailor's establishment from which comes the sound of an argument conducted in a language you don't recognise. In the middle of the bridge there's a chapel, the Chapel of St. Thomas of Canterbury, which sits on a pier projecting out over the river on the downstream side. And when you reach the gap in the buildings that allows you to look out over the water, you stop for a moment and look. The river from here is different from the river at the tower stairs or from the water gate. Here you are above it, looking down from the parapet wall at the water rushing through the arches below, and the sound of it is louder than you expected. A continuous roar that you realise you've been hearing since you stepped onto the bridge, but that resolves now into its source. The tide is falling, which means the water on the upstream side of the bridge is higher than the water on the downstream side, and the difference is visible from here, a step in the surface of the river where it drops as it pushes through the narrow arches between the piers. The current through those arches is fast enough to overturn a boat. You learned this from Giles, who learned it from a previous head cook who'd seen it happen. The watermen call it shooting the bridge, the practice of taking a boat through the arches rather than around them, which saves time and which is survivable if you know exactly what you're doing and fatal if you don't. Most of them don't try it. Most of them take the long way around. You watch the water for a moment, the muscular urgency of it, and you think about the piers below you, their stone bases sunk into the riverbed, holding all of this up. The weight of the buildings and the traffic and the 200 people going about their lives, all of it resting on stone that has been in the river since the 12th century and shows no signs of changing its mind. A cart passes behind you close enough that you feel the draft of it, and you step back from the parapet and continue south. Southwark is on the other side of the river, and it is, as everyone in London knows, different from the North Bank. Not worse exactly, though it is poorer in the visible way of places where the less regulated activities of a city have been pushed by the city's own preferences to the far bank, where the city's jurisdiction is looser and the oversight is thinner, and the variety of things you can find is correspondingly wider. The theatres are here, or were before they moved. The bear baiting and the bull baiting rings are here. The stews, which is the word the city uses for establishments that are officially licensed bathhouses, and unofficially somewhat more than that, are here, several of them in a row along the bank in the area called Bankside. You cross the bridge and walk into Southwark, and immediately the quality of the streets is different, narrower and muddier, and smelling more strongly of the things that streets smell of when the cleaning of them is someone's lower priority, and the buildings have a different character, more improvised, more layered with previous lives, more willing to lean into their own decline. The people on the streets look harder than the people on Cornhill, or perhaps they look the same and you're seeing them differently because of the context. Hardness might be something you project onto poverty because it's easier to look at than the alternatives. You don't have business in Southwark today. You cross the bridge and come back, and it's enough, it's sufficient, it's the knowledge that this other city exists within the city and that the bridge is the hinge between them. On the way back north through the bridge buildings, you pass a woman selling hot pies from her basket, and the smell hits you from 20 feet away, and your body responds with the uncomplicated directness that it always responds to the smell of hot food after hours of walking. You buy one. It's a penny. The pastry is thick and the filling is meat and onion and something peppery. Probably not the finest ingredients, definitely not the finest pastry, and it is extremely good in the specific way that food eaten, standing up in the middle of a bridge, with the sounds of the river below and the city around you, and the specific tiredness of a morning's walking in your legs, is always the best possible version of itself. You eat it leaning against the parapet on the downstream side of the bridge, looking back at the tower, which you can see from here between the buildings, its white tower catching the mid-morning light. 3 years you've lived in that building. It looks, from here, entirely like what it is, which is a fortress built to contain things, to hold the things that needed holding, to be the hard point around which softer things arrange themselves. You think about Sir William Harwood, who looked at the same sky from a higher window and listened to church bells and asked for the broth to be hot. You think about the march-pane stars on the green cloth. You finish the pie and wipe your hands on your coat and start back toward the tower with your bags, the fish and the spices and the dry goods, everything Giles asked for, the purse lighter by the appropriate amount, the morning used correctly. And you feel, walking back through the streets of the city toward the water stairs where you'll take a boat back to the tower landing, something that is not quite contentment and not quite satisfaction, but is something built from both of them, the specific feeling of a body that has done what it was supposed to do in the world on a particular day, that has moved through the world correctly and brought back what was needed and eaten a pie on a bridge in the July sun. London has a smell in July that you will remember for the rest of your life. the coal smoke and the river and the horses and the 10,000 other things that contribute to the sum of it. And you're walking through it with the weight of provisions on your shoulder and the sun on your left side and the sounds of the city all around you. And you're not a boy from Cheapside anymore and not quite a man yet, but something in between, something still being made. The way dough is something in between flour and bread during the rising, something alive with process. The water stairs are where you left them. The Thames is where it always is. The tower rises on the other bank as you step into the wherry and the waterman pushes off, and the city recedes behind you, and the familiar stone walls approach, and by the time you step back onto the tower landing, the morning is still an hour from noon, and you have everything you came for, and you have seen London Bridge from the middle, and eaten a pie standing up, and watched the water shoot through the arches, and filed away information about Dutch spice merchants, and noted the quality of the morning's mackerel. You carry the bags into the kitchen and set them on the work table. Giles looks at them. He looks at you. The nutmeg prices are up, you say. The Portuguese supply ship was delayed. The Bruise boy suggested looking at the Dutch merchants at the steelyard on Fridays. Giles is quiet for a moment. Then he says, "The steelyard prices aren't always what they seem on first offer, but it's worth a look." He opens the canvas bag and examines the parcels inside, checking the weights, opening one paper package and smelling the contents. He nods. "The fish," he says. 2 dozen sole, 8 mackerel. The mackerel were yesterday's stock. I got them down on price." He nods again. Then he says, without looking up from the bag, "Did you eat anything?" "A pie. On the bridge." "How was it?" "Good." He makes a sound that might be approval. Then he says, "Get the sole cleaned and on ice. The mackerel can wait for tomorrow." "Yes, sir." You take the fish to the cold larder and begin the work of cleaning them, the knife going in behind the gills, the familiar sequence of movements, the smell of fresh fish and cold stone, and the particular cool clarity of the larder air. Your hands know what to do. Your hands have been learning what to do for 3 years, and they know it now. The knowledge settled into muscle and reflex, available without thought. Outside, London is doing all the things London does in the middle of a Tuesday in July. The river is running, the markets are trading, the bridge is full of people crossing between one version of the city and the other. Somewhere on Cornhill, the spice merchants are selling what they have at the prices they're offering, and the Dutch merchants at the steelyard are available on Fridays. You clean the fish. The afternoon passes in the way of afternoons that have mornings of consequence behind them, a little faster, a little lighter. The body and mind having done something real in the world, and now completing the day with the satisfied efficiency of a person who has already earned their rest before the rest arrives. By evening you're back in the dormitory, and the light through the small east-facing window is the low amber light of a July evening that is taking its time about becoming a July night, which is one of the things about summer that you have never found it possible to dislike regardless of the heat. The light simply lasting longer than it has any obligation to, giving the day a generosity of extension that other seasons don't manage. You sit on the edge of your bed with your boots off, feeling the cool of the stone floor against the soles of your feet, and you think about the bridge and the river and the pie and the way the water looked shooting through the arches. You think about the woman in the upper window with her cooking smells coming out over the Thames, making something with onions in a kitchen hanging over water. Tomorrow there will be the normal kitchen work. The fires to build and the bread to start and whatever Giles has planned for the midday and the evening services, the endless productive repetition of the work. You will do it with the same attention you always do, because that's what the work requires. Because Giles taught you that the ordinary meal deserves the same seriousness as the extraordinary one. Because a kitchen that saves its best for the occasions the cook personally deems worthy is a kitchen that is failing everyone it was built to feed. But tonight there is the light in the window and the cool floor and the sounds of the tower settling into its evening. The warders changing watch, the garrison talking somewhere in the outer ward, the river beyond the walls doing its tidal business, the same river it was this morning when you watched it from the bridge, the same river it was when Thomas More was here, and Anne Boleyn was here, and Sir William Harwood was here, the same river it will be when you are old, and all of this is memory. The light fades slowly. You think about what you've learned and what you haven't learned yet, and the distance between them, which is still very large, which is in fact the most honest thing you know about your situation, that the distance between what you know and what there is to know is not decreasing as fast as you'd like, and is probably not going to decrease as fast as you'd like. And this is simply the truth of learning anything that has real depth to it. There's always more. The spice cabinet has more jars than the ones you've opened. The river has more history than the parts you've seen. The city has more streets than the ones you've walked. There is always more, and that is not a problem. That is, if you hold it the right way, the best possible news. The light goes. The window shows stars briefly before the clouds that have been building on the western horizon come across and cover them. The slow advance of something that will be rain by morning if the feel of the air means what it usually means. You lie back on the mattress. The straw makes its familiar settling sound under you. The blanket has the familiar smell of the room, of you and the previous days, and the general warmth of sleeping bodies. A smell that is not entirely pleasant and is entirely yours, the smell of a place where you belong, somewhere in the city, across the river, in the taverns that line the south bank of the Thames, and in the alehouses of Cheapside and the ordinaries near the markets, and the coffeeless drinking places that won't become coffee houses for another 100 years. London is doing what it does at night, which is everything it does in the day, but louder and with less social supervision. You are not there tonight. Tonight you are here, in the dormitory, in the tower, in the city, in the country, in the year 1536, in the reign of Henry VIII, who is currently between wives in a way that will shortly resolve itself, in the life of Thomas Apsley, who went to Billingsgate this morning and bought fish and walked on London Bridge and ate a pie and came home. The word homelands, you let it. Rain starts on the roof, the first drops large and distinct, then accumulating into the general sound of rain, which is one of the most sleep-producing sounds in the human experience. Something about its regularity and its evenness, the way it fills the acoustic space without demanding anything from you, the way it says the world is doing what the world does and you can lie here and let it. You close your eyes. The rain comes down. The tower is quiet except for the rain, and the distant sound of the river, and someone in the courtyard below moving towards shelter with quick footsteps, and then the sound of a door, and then nothing except the rain. Sleep comes like water rising, slowly and then completely, the edges of thought going soft and then softer, and then nothing, just the body in the bed, and the rain on the roof, and the long, uncomplicated passage into rest. The autumn of 1536 arrives the way autumn always arrives in this part of England, which is as a gradual withdrawal of warmth rather than a dramatic announcement of cold. The light changes first, becoming something more horizontal and more golden in the afternoons, the sun sitting lower in the sky and making longer shadows across the inner ward, the stone catching it differently, the whole tower looking slightly more itself in autumn light than it does in the high white light of summer. Then the temperature starts its descent, not quickly, not in one step, but in the accumulated increments of mornings that are a little colder than the last, and evenings that close in a little earlier, until one day in the second week of October, you go to split kindling before the morning fire, and your breath clouds in the courtyard air, and you realise that winter is not coming, but is simply here, having arrived while you were paying attention to other things. 3 years and some months now. 3 years of fires and fish and bread and sauces and the spice cabinet, and Giles watching you with those river water eyes and correcting you with the economy of a man who doesn't believe in wasting words when a look or a silence will do the same job. 3 years of the tower's specific rhythms, which you carry in your body now the way you carry any habit that has been performed long enough to become reflex. The kitchen has a new arrangement in October of 1536. Margaret Brew left in August to marry a baker in Aldgate, which everyone in the kitchen knew was coming because she'd been walking with a particular quality of contentment since June. That meant either love or an unusually good profit on some personal transaction, and Margaret was not the type for unusual profits. Her leaving creates a vacancy in the bread and pastry work that Giles fills partly by reorganising what the remaining 4 of you do, and partly by giving more of it to you, which is either recognition of your development or a pragmatic response to necessity or both. And you do the work without commenting on the reasoning because the reasoning is irrelevant to the work itself. You make the bread every morning now, every morning without exception. The fire first, and then the flour, and then the water, and then the yeast, and then the kneading that your arms know how to do before your mind is fully engaged with the day. The physical process running on its own track, while the rest of you is still organising itself into consciousness. The bread comes out of the oven every morning smelling the way bread always smells coming out of an oven, which is the smell that stops people in their tracks even when they know it's coming, even when they've smelled it every morning for years, the specific warm fact of it that has no equivalent in any other smell in the world. You will make bread for the rest of your life. This is not a constraint. This is simply a truth about what you've become. In November, Giles gets sick. Not seriously, not immediately alarmingly sick, but a persistent chest cold that settles in and refuses to leave. And for 2 weeks he works at a reduced capacity that for Giles looks like normal human capacity. The adjustment visible only in the fact that he sits when he would usually stand and defers to you on decisions he would usually make himself. He doesn't acknowledge this. You don't comment on it. You simply take the decisions he defers and make them as correctly as you can, and he reviews them after the fact with nods that have the quality of someone grading a test paper, where the answers turned out to be right. "The Tuesday beef service," he says one evening, sitting by the east fire with a cup of warmed ale that you brought him without being asked. You used the white wine reduction instead of the plain stock. The plain stock wasn't ready yet when the sauce needed starting, you say. The white wine version is richer, but it matches the cup better anyway. He is quiet for a moment, drinking the ale. "It was better," he says. This is 3 words from Giles. 3 words from Giles is a speech. You carry them in the same careful way you've carried the other things he's said, in the pocket of yourself that keeps these things, the things that matter more than they are allowed to show on the surface. He recovers. By December he is back to full operation, standing where he stood before, making the decisions, correcting the errors, running the kitchen with the particular absolute authority of a person who's been doing something for so long and so well that the authority doesn't need to announce itself. But something has shifted between you. Some balance has adjusted, and you both know it without discussing it, and the not discussing it is part of how it works. Christmas of 1536 comes, and you make the marchpane again, and this time the shapes are better, more precise, the texture exactly where it should be, the glaze smoother. Giles tastes one and sets it down and says nothing, which is by this point a language you speak fluently. Nothing from Giles about a piece of marchpane you've made for the high table means excellent. You make 20 of them, each one a 5-pointed star, each one identical to the others within the margin that handwork always allows, laid out on a board covered with white linen and looking, in the kitchen's firelight, like something you might actually be proud of. You are actually proud of them. This is allowed. Winter passes. The cold does its work on the city, and the city does its work on the cold. The Thames freezes partially in January. The shallows along the banks catch an ice that the current can't quite move, and for 3 weeks in February the ice is thick enough in some places that boys from the city run out onto it and slide, which the watermen watch with the expressions of men who know exactly how thick the ice is and how thick it needs to be, and have calculated that the boys are on the wrong side of that calculation, but are not personally responsible for the outcome. The frost fair doesn't materialise this year. The ice isn't thick enough across the full width. But there are mornings in February when the tower's moat is frozen solid, and the courtyard cobblestones are glazed, and the air that comes in through the kitchen door has a crystalline quality that sits in your throat like something you should be careful with. On one of those February mornings you are at the east fire at the beginning of the day, the first fire, the one you light before the others, and while the kindling is catching and the light is just starting to come through the high window, you stand in the warmth of the fire with your hands held out toward it, and you are aware, with a clarity that is partly the quality of the early morning and partly something else, of where you are and what it amounts to. You are 19 years old. You're a cook, or nearly one. You can make a sauce, a broth, a bread, a pastry, a spiced wine. You can balance a spice and read a fire and break down most of the animals and birds and fish that come into this kitchen with competence that is approaching the edge of mastery. The edge being the place beyond which competence becomes something that doesn't need to be thought about anymore because it's simply what you do. You can make marchpane stars that make Giles silent in the specific way that means excellent. You were 15 when you arrived here with a sack and a knife and a letter that said honest and hard-working. The knife is still the same knife, worn smoother now at the handle, the blade thinned slightly from 4 years of sharpening. The honest and hard-working is still true. The person holding the knife is someone else entirely from the boy who arrived with it. The fire catches properly. The wood takes the heat, and the room begins to warm, and the first smells of the day rise around you. Wood smoke and the residual heat of last night's cooking still in the stones, and the familiar cold morning smell of the kitchen itself, which you know the way you know your own reflection, which is to say well enough that any deviation from it would register immediately. You start the bread. The year turns from 1536 into 1537, and England keeps doing what England is doing in this period, which is being a country that is reinventing itself at significant speed in ways that are not entirely comfortable for any of the people inside it. The break with Rome is complete and has been for 3 years, but the consequences of it keep arriving. The monasteries being dissolved across the country, their lands redistributed, the monks turned out, the whole ancient architecture of the Catholic Church in England being systematically dismantled and replaced with something new that has the same broad shape, but is answerable to the king rather than the pope, which turns out to be a significant difference in practice, even if it sounds like a minor adjustment in theory. The Pilgrimage of Grace comes and goes in the north, which is a rebellion of people who want the old ways back, the monasteries, and the Latin Mass, and the calendar of saints that has ordered their lives for generations, and it fails, which rebellions in Tudor England almost always do, and its leaders are executed, which is what happens to leaders of failed rebellions in Tudor England with the regularity of a rule rather than a decision. You hear about it in fragments, the way you hear about everything that happens beyond the tower's walls, in the conversation that drifts through kitchens, the way weather drifts through gaps in walls, and you file it alongside everything else you've heard in this building, in this period, in this reign, in this century that is still only in its 4th decade, and is already packed with enough consequence to fill 5 ordinary centuries. Henry VIII marries Jane Seymour in the spring of 1536, after Anne Boleyn, and Jane Seymour dies in the autumn of 1537, after giving birth to a son who lives and becomes Edward, Prince of Wales, which is what England needed more than anything else, and what it gets at the cost of the mother who provided it, which is an accounting that nobody in a position of power considers unreasonable, and that most women in England understand to be simply the price of the arrangement. You hear about Jane Seymour's death on an October evening, almost exactly 2 years after you cooked for Sir William Harwood, and you think briefly about that coincidence of timing, and then you go back to the pot you're tending, because the pot requires attention, and the history of England will arrange itself with or without your commentary. The river of it keeps moving. You're standing on its bank. You learn to watch it without being pulled in. Your 4th year in the Tower kitchen is the year you stop thinking about the work and simply do it. The way you stop thinking about breathing at some point in childhood and simply breathe. The conscious supervision dissolving into something more fundamental, more owned. You know the kitchen now, not with your mind, but with your body. The temperature of each fire by the feel of the heat on your face from 6 feet away. The state of a sauce by the smell of it from across the room. The readiness of bread by the sound it makes when you knock it. The hollow drum of cooked bread being different from the dense thud of underdone in a way that you know before you consciously register the sound. Giles notices this. Of course he notices. He notices everything. On a morning in the spring of 1537, he sends the other kitchen workers on various tasks and stays in the kitchen with you while you work on a midday service. And he watches you with the river water eyes, and at the end of an hour he says, "You're not thinking about it any more." You look up from the sauce. "Sir?" "The work. You're not thinking about it. You're just doing it." He has the ledger open in front of him but hasn't been looking at it. That's the difference between a kitchen hand and a cook. The cook stops thinking. You consider this. I still make mistakes. You'll always make mistakes, that's not the point. The point is whether you're making them because you don't know what you're doing, or because you made a judgment that turned out to be wrong. He closes the ledger. The first kind you fix with more learning. The second kind you fix by thinking better. You're making the second kind now. He goes back to the ledger. The conversation is over, as his conversations always are when they're over, without transition. But something has been said. Something has been given you. You carry it in the pocket with the other things. Your 4th Christmas in the Tower, and by this point the Christmas production is something you contribute to at a level that is close to equal to Giles's own contribution, planning alongside him, rather than simply executing his plans, discussing the menu and the provision and the sequence of preparation with him in the evenings, as a collaboration rather than a student receiving instruction. The marchpane is yours without question now. The sauce work is yours. The bread has always been yours. On Christmas morning of 1537, the kitchen produces a feast that Giles reviews afterward, with the expression he makes for things that have gone exactly as they should. The capon is perfect. The sauce is perfect. The marchpane stars are perfect, identical, smooth. The glaze catching the candlelight like the surface of still water. You stand in the kitchen after the service and look at the room, which is the aftermath of a day's full production. The fires low, the pans soaking, the counters clear, the residual smell of everything you made hanging in the warm air like the last note of a piece of music. This is your work. This is what you do. This is the kitchen, which is yours in the way that a place becomes yours when you have given it enough of yourself, when you have come to know it better than you know most things, when its walls and its fires and its smells have become part of the structure of your daily experience, as familiar as breathing. You are 20 years old. 5 more years until your apprenticeship ends. The future is a kitchen you haven't walked into yet, but you know how kitchens work. The evening of the 21st of December is the longest night of the year. After the Christmas service is complete and the kitchen is cleaned and the fires banked and the other workers dispersed to their beds or their evenings, you find yourself sitting on the stool by the east fire, the way Giles sometimes sits, in the quiet of the kitchen after everything is done. The fire is low. The room is warm with the warmth of a day's cooking held in the stone. The smell is the composite smell of Christmas, spice and fat and sweet and smoke, everything blended together in the specific atmosphere of a room where extraordinary things have been made in the last 14 hours. You think about Sir William Harwood holding his hands over the broth bowl in the steam. You think about what he said, that this went right, that he wanted you to know. You think about how you've made hundreds of dishes since then, thousands. The daily accumulation of meals that feed the tower's population across its hierarchy of entitlement and occasion, and how each of those dishes was made with the same attention you brought to his tray. Because that attention became what you do, became the standard you hold yourself to, became the thing Giles heard in the silence when he tasted the Tuesday beef reduction. You think about the woman in the upper window on London Bridge, making something with onions in a kitchen hanging over water, and how the smell came out over the river, and how you noticed it, and how it was simply someone cooking, simply someone in a kitchen doing what needed doing. The most ordinary transaction in the world, the transaction that keeps people alive and makes the ordinary life feel like something worth living. The fire crackles once, settling lower. Outside, the tower's nighttime sounds are beginning, the watch being called, the gates being checked, the garrison in the outer ward doing whatever the garrison does at the end of a day that contained Christmas. The river is there beyond the walls, as it always is, doing its tidal business, the water rising and falling on its own schedule without reference to what day it is, or what the kitchen smelled like, or whether the marchpane came out right. Everything continues. This is the central fact of existence in this century, in this city, in this building that contains and has contained so many lives and so many ends of lives. Everything continues. The river continues. The kitchen continues. The fires are banked tonight and lit again tomorrow, and the bread is made tomorrow, and the sauces are started tomorrow, and the tower feeds its population tomorrow the same way it fed it today, and yesterday, and the day before. You are part of that continuation, a small part, a kitchen hand becoming cook part, but continuous, uninterrupted, the same hands in the same kitchen on the same ground above the same river. Whatever else this city is doing, whatever history is arranging itself into out there in the streets and the halls of power and the cold rooms of the tower's upper floors, you are here, and the food is made and the people are fed, and that matters, has always mattered, will always matter, in the specific, unspectacular way of things that have to happen for any of the spectacular things to be possible. The fire drops lower. The room is very quiet. You stay by the fire a little longer, your hands loose in your lap, your feet flat on the cold stone floor. The warmth on your face and the cold at your back, both of them present and real and part of the same moment. And then you go upstairs. The dormitory is dark, the other workers already asleep. Their breathing filling the room with the low irregular sound of several people doing the same thing at slightly different rhythms. The smell of the room is the smell of people, of wool and sweat, and the residual warmth of sleeping bodies, a smell that is not elegant and is entirely human and is home. Your bed is where you left it this morning, which it always is, the straw mattress and the wool blanket, the thin pillow that is a folded piece of cloth, the whole modest arrangement that has contained your sleep for 4 years and will contain it for some years more before you find yourself somewhere else, in a different room, in a different kitchen, in a different configuration of the same life. You sit on the edge of the bed and take off your boots, the cold of the stone floor coming up through your stocking soles immediately, and you set them aside and lie back on the mattress and pull the blanket up to your chin. The ceiling above you is low and has a water stain in the shape of nothing in particular. You know this ceiling. You know this water stain. You know the specific quality of the darkness in this room on a December night when the cloud cover is complete and there is no moonlight to lighten anything, only the deep and absolute dark of a world before street lighting. The kind of dark that city dwellers of later centuries will find disturbing and that you find simply comfortable, simply the way night is when it is being properly itself. Your arms ache pleasantly from the day's work, the long-sustained effort of the Christmas service, and your legs ache pleasantly too. The ache of a body that stood on stone floors for 14 hours and did what it was asked and is now ready for what it needs, which is horizontal and warm and the slow cessation of effort. You think about the broth. The very first broth, the one you made almost 2.5 years ago in the middle of the night with the particular care of someone who understood that care was the only thing they had to give. You think about standing at the middle fire at 3 a.m. with the pot beginning to show the first tremor of a simmer, the pepper and the onion and the bones doing their slow work in the water, the smell of it beginning to become something worth making. That broth is gone. Of course it is gone. It was consumed, every drop of it, by a man who is also gone, who has been gone for over 2 years, who existed in this building for 6 weeks, and then ceased to exist and left behind a water stain of himself in the people who encountered him, which is the only kind of mark any of us leave, these water stains in other people, the impressions that don't quite wash out. He said it went right. It did go right. You close your eyes. The dormitory breathes around you. You think about tomorrow, which will be the 22nd of December, and will involve the normal kitchen work, the bread and the fires and the daily service, the continuation of what continues, and you think about it with the specific low-level pleasure of someone who knows what their work is and knows they can do it, and is not afraid of doing it again tomorrow. You are warm enough, fed enough, skilled enough, present enough. This is enough. This is, in the particular context of England in 1537, considerably more than most people have. There are people sleeping in doorways tonight in the streets of London, the city making no particular provision for those who couldn't find shelter, and there are people in the tower's lower rooms who have considerably less than warm beds and adequate food. And there are people in the country who are watching their grain stores and calculating whether what they have will last until the next harvest, and finding the calculation uncomfortable. You're in a warm room with a full stomach and work you know how to do waiting for you in the morning. This is enough. The thought settles into you and stays there. Your breathing slows. The thoughts that have been running through the rooms of your mind all day begin to lose their sharpness, the edges softening the way edges soften when the light goes, when the critical apparatus of waking consciousness starts to let go of its supervision of everything. The bread will rise tomorrow. It always rises. This is the nature of bread, that it rises when you give it the right conditions, the warmth and the time and the right proportions of everything it needs, and then it does what it does, the yeast working its invisible chemistry in the dark of the proving, the dough growing and softening and becoming what it needs to become, and in the morning you put it in the oven and it becomes what it always becomes, which is something warm and real and worth eating. You think about learning. You think about what it is to be in the middle of learning something, which is to be uncomfortable much of the time, and to occasionally feel the specific relief of understanding arriving. The moment when a thing that was difficult becomes easy, when the hands know what the mind has been labouring over, when the effort becomes simply the work. You think about the nutmeg in the spice cabinet, which came from the Moluccas, which are islands so far away they are barely imaginable, and about the sailor you'll never meet, who didn't die in the storm that might have caught the ship it was on, and about how that sailor's survival resulted in a piece of nutmeg arriving in a kitchen in London, in the Tower, on the north bank of the Thames, available to be grated over a sauce by a cook who is learning what he's doing. Everything is connected to everything else. The kitchen is connected to the spice trade, is connected to the ships, is connected to the weather, is connected to the price of nutmeg at a merchant's on Cornhill on a Tuesday in July, when you walked in with a list and a leather purse and the morning still wide open around you. The dormitory is quiet. The river is outside the walls, constant as always, the tide doing what the tide does, the great slow breathing of the world's water moving through the city as it has moved through the city for longer than the city has existed. Somewhere in England right now there are people making bread, hundreds of them, thousands of them, in kitchens like this one and kitchens nothing like this one. Bakers and housewives and monastery cooks and the cooks of great houses and small houses and taverns, everyone making what needs making. The daily work of feeding people continuing through the night as it always continues. No pause for darkness or cold or whatever else the world is doing. You are part of that. You're one of those hands in one of those kitchens, the bread already prepared for tomorrow, waiting in the bowl with a cloth over it, the yeast already at work in the warm dark, doing what it does without being asked. The thought is very comfortable. The thought is the most comfortable thought available. Your arms have stopped aching, your legs have stopped aching. The pleasant tiredness of the body that has done its work is dissolving into something simpler and softer. The tiredness that is on the other side of effort, the tiredness that is actually rest beginning to announce itself. You are not thinking about the broth anymore. You're not thinking about the bridge. You're not thinking about the spice cabinet or the marchpane or the sound of the fire or the specific way Giles closes a ledger when he's heard something worth hearing. You're simply here, in the dark, in the warm, in the room where you sleep, in the building where you work, in the city that is your city now, In the year there will become another year, and then another year, and then another, each one adding to what you know, each one asking something from you that you'll find you have. The city is out there, the river is out there, the future is out there, full of kitchens you haven't walked into yet, full of meals you haven't made yet, full of the small moments of recognition that come when a thing is done correctly, when the sauce is right, when the bread is right, when something that started as flour and water becomes what it was supposed to become. You'll find them. You always find them. For now there is the dark and the quiet and the low sound of sleeping all around you, the sound of people resting from their work, the sound of the tower at the end of a day, the sound of London doing what London does when the working hours are over, which is continuing. Let it continue. Let the river run. Let the fires burn low and be built up again in the morning. Let the bread rise in the bowl in the warm dark. Let the city breathe. Let the stars behind the clouds do their enormous indifferent work. Let sleep come the way it's coming now, slowly and then completely, the way the warmth of a kitchen fills a cold room when the fires are built up properly, starting at the edges and working toward the centre, the cold retreating and the warmth taking the space that the cold held, and everything settling into the temperature of a room where someone has been tending the fire. You are warm enough. You have done what needed doing. You will do it again tomorrow. This is the shape of a good life. Not the spectacular kind, not the kind that ends up on the pages of the documents that historians will read 5 centuries from now, but the real kind, the daily bread kind, the kind that keeps the world running while the spectacular kind makes its noise. Let it be enough. It is enough. Centuries will pass. The tower, you know, will become something else, something that people visit to look at rather than live inside, its dungeons made into tours, its history made into plaques on walls, its kitchens renovated into something that would astonish you if you could see it, the fires replaced by something that produces heat from a box on the wall, the stone floors covered with surfaces you can't imagine. The Thames will be tamed, or nearly tamed, its tides managed and its banks reinforced, the bridge you walked across replaced several times over, until the version that stands in the future is nothing like the one you leaned against when you ate your pie. The smell of the city will change. The coal smoke will be cleaned eventually after it has gotten much worse, and then been addressed by laws that didn't exist in your time. The horses will be gone. The pigs in the streets will be gone. The gin shops will be gone, or transformed into something that serves the same function under a different name. But people will still make bread. People will always make bread. They will put their hands in the dough on cold mornings and feel it resist and then yield, and the smell of it coming out of the oven will still stop them in the same way it stopped you. Will still produce in them the same response that has no better name than home, that goes past thought to something older and more fundamental. The response of a body to something it has needed for as long as bodies have existed, and someone will make a sauce and taste it and find it right, and there will be a moment of recognition, the moment that is the same in every kitchen in every century, when the thing is what it should be, when the work has succeeded, when what you set out to make is what you've made. Those moments don't change. They have never changed. They will not change. The human heart at the moment of that recognition is the same human heart it's always been. And people will lie down at the end of their working days, in their beds, in their rooms, in their cities, tired from what they did and ready for what sleep is, and they will look at the ceiling, whatever ceiling is above them in whatever century they're living in, and they will let the thoughts go soft and the edges of consciousness go quiet, and they will feel what you're feeling right now, which is the specific and reliable comfort of a body that has done its work and is being returned to rest. That doesn't change either. Whatever changes, that doesn't change. Sleep now. Let the dormitory hold you. Let the tower hold the dormitory. Let the city hold the tower. Let the river hold the city, the way it always has, the way it will when everything else has changed. The water that has been running since before any of this was built and will be running when nothing visible of any of it remains. Let it run. Let the years run. Let the bread rise in the dark. You've earned this rest. You've made the broth hot. You've reduced the sauce correctly. You've made the marchpane exactly what it should be. You've done the work and done it well, and tomorrow you'll do it again, and the next day, and the day after that, and each time it will be exactly what it needs to be, exactly what the day requires, exactly enough. The sound of sleeping, the sound of the river, the sound of London not quite stopping, the way it never quite stops. The low murmur of a city that has been awake since before dawn, and will be awake again before dawn, and merely rests in the hours between, waiting for the fires to be lit and the bread to be started and another day to begin. The church bell, somewhere beyond the walls, strikes an hour in the deep night. The sound of it travels over the rooftops and across the water, and through the gaps in the tower's walls, and into the dormitory where you lie in the dark in the warm under the wool blanket that smells of all your sleeping nights. One note, then another, then another, then silence, then just the river, then just the dark, then rest. You are Thomas Apsley. You make things that matter. You're learning what you're doing. You will keep learning, but not tonight. Tonight you sleep. Good night.